68 years ago, a 5-year-old girl vanished right in front of her own house on what seemed like a perfectly ordinary afternoon, disappearing without a trace and leaving her family plunged into despair. Authorities suspected a man who lived nearby, a man who also vanished from the neighborhood at the exact same time, but with no body found and far too few leads to follow, the investigation quickly hit a dead end. Yet through all those years, one brother never gave up hope, clinging to the faintest belief that his little sister was still out there somewhere. Then one day, from a seemingly random DNA sample, he uncovered a crucial detail that everyone else had missed. A detail powerful enough to turn the entire case upside down and shock everyone involved in a way no one saw coming. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit subscribe. Greensboro, North Carolina, 1957. A small southern town, still finding its footing in the post-war years, where rows of white-painted wooden houses stretched along quiet suburban streets and working-class families lived simple, predictable lives. Maple Hollow Road was one of those neighborhoods, peaceful, with low fences separating wide lawns, kids playing in the afternoons while adults tended gardens, swept porches, or chatted with neighbors. The Reed family lived in the third house from the corner, a small but tidy home, distinguished by the wooden porch, swing out front, and the garden Helen Reed cared for every day. Thomas Reed, a 35-year-old mechanic at the local garage, had the calm demeanor and careful nature of someone used to working with heavy machinery. Helen, 29, an elementary school teacher, was gentle but sensitive, always keeping a close eye on their firstborn daughter. Paul, their youngest, was only 2 and usually carried everywhere by his mother. At the center of the family was 5-year-old Amelia Reed, blonde curly hair, fair skin, crystal clear blue eyes, and a personality that blended natural curiosity with an innate caution. Every afternoon, Amelia was allowed to play in the front yard while her mother prepared dinner. The Reed yard opened right onto the street, but Maple Hollow Road saw so little traffic that neighborhood kids freely ran around or kicked balls without much adult warning. 2 houses down lived the Carson family. Their 17-year-old daughter, Betty Carson, often kept an eye on Amelia from across the fence or while walking past. That afternoon was no different from any other. Except for a few small details no one thought were unusual at the time. Betty noticed a man standing at the far end of the street, far away, but close enough to make out that he was wearing a fedora and standing unnaturally still, his gaze seemingly fixed on Amelia. At the same time, a black Ford Custom Line was parked at the edge of the woods, about 40 meters from the Reed house. The engine turned off, then started again, then shut off once more. Sounds that caught Betty's attention, but she just assumed the car was having trouble. Helen didn't notice. She was tending to Paul in the kitchen. Amelia kicked her red ball back and forth across the grass, chasing it whenever it rolled too far, quietly singing a nursery rhyme she loved. Around 4 p.m., Helen called Amelia over to fix her jacket, but the moment she turned inside to grab a cloth, just 40 seconds by her estimate, she stepped back out. In that time, Betty was standing on her own porch, casually watching the street and the Reed yard, sensing no danger but not taking her eyes off Amelia for long. The instant Helen disappeared inside, Amelia kicked the ball a little too hard. The red ball rolled down to the edge of the road, spun a few more times, and stopped. Betty followed the ball with her eyes and briefly saw Amelia run toward it. She turned away for a few seconds because her mother called her, and when she looked back, Amelia was gone. The yard was empty, except for the ball rolling one last time before coming to rest. No footsteps, no scream, no sound of a struggle or impact. Betty walked to the fence and called Amelia's name. No answer. Helen stepped out, holding the cloth, and saw Betty in a panic, pointing toward the edge of the road. The two ran over, scanning everywhere, but Amelia was nowhere. The silence on Maple Hollow Road in that moment felt so unnatural that Helen froze for a few seconds before her frantic, breaking cries of her daughter's name filled the air. Thomas heard his wife from the garage, ran out, looked around, and immediately bolted to the road, checking neighboring yards, ditches, and calling neighbors for help. It all unfolded in a few chaotic minutes. After searching the entire edge of the yard and the dirt road with still no sign of Amelia, Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, breathing hard, eyes darting one last hopeless time. With nothing left to check immediately, he rushed back inside, grabbed the phone by the window, his hand shaking as he dialed. He managed only short, broken words. His 5-year-old daughter had just vanished right in front of their house. Less than 10 seconds later, that call appeared on the switchboard at the Greensboro Police Department. Thomas Reed's call was logged at 4:17 p.m., initially classified as a possible missing child, a term that in 1957 did not yet trigger the full modern emergency protocol, but was immediately flagged as a priority response. The dispatcher on duty, Marion Hayes, quickly followed the 1957 verification steps: victim's age, last seen time, child's health, likelihood of wandering off, and exact time out of sight. The moment she heard Thomas say, "Just 1 minute," and no sign of wandering, Marion upgraded the case to the highest priority within juvenile emergency. Although there was no Amber Alert system yet, any disappearance of a child under 6 was treated as immediate danger, especially when it happened so fast and without signs of leaving the area voluntarily. Marion relayed the information over internal radio, calling patrol units in the Maple Hollow Road area and activating the rapid response team. The officer assigned to lead was Sergeant Raymond Tucker, the most experienced on shift and someone who had handled several child disappearances before. Tucker heard the initial description over the radio: 5-year-old girl, gone in under a minute, quiet residential street, scene possibly already disturbed by neighbors searching. That was enough for Tucker to know this was not routine. He immediately requested 2 additional patrol cars from nearby sectors to converge on Maple Hollow Road and called the K9 unit station 10 minutes away. A young officer at the desk quickly filled out the short report form: child's name, address, time missing, number of witnesses, any unusual sounds, movements, or objects. Tucker asked the dispatcher to keep the family on the line for real-time updates while he and the patrol team approached the scene. Over the radio, he asked additional questions the desk hadn't covered yet. Could the child walk far on her own? Was she afraid of strangers? Was she carrying anything? Any strange vehicles near the time of disappearance? Thomas, still frantic, could only answer in fragments. Those answers were noted and marked to be verified on scene. 3 patrol cars left the station by the fastest route to Maple Hollow Road. The K9 unit was prepped. Dogs were given a scent article from one of Amelia's personal items that Helen provided under dispatcher guidance: a jacket from the living room. Meanwhile, Tucker reviewed the neighborhood map, identifying exits, easiest escape routes for a stranger, and noted 3 points: the woods bordering Maple Hollow, a shortcut to the small highway south, and a service station less than 4 minutes' drive away. As the 3 patrol units neared Maple Hollow Road, radio updates kept coming. Neighbors had stopped searching the front yard at the family's request. Thomas was standing in the middle of the street waiting, and Betty Carson, the only witness besides Helen, was near the fence, still in shock. K9 reported en route, ETA 7 minutes. Tucker took in all the information while driving in and quickly concluded this was not a typical wandering off case. Disappearance too fast, terrain offered no cover to leave sight. No signs of a fall, and especially the unusual presence of the black Ford. Something he marked for immediate checking the moment he arrived. When Sergeant Raymond Tucker's car stopped in front of the Reed house, the scene confirmed his worst fears. The area was already heavily contaminated, neighbors still scattered despite being asked to step back, and the lawn was covered in footprints from more than a dozen people who had run back and forth in the chaotic minutes after Amelia vanished. Tucker quickly assessed the damage. The entire front yard of the Reed house was no longer in its original state. Near the curb where the ball was found, there were at least 3 different adult shoe impressions. The ground near the fence was trampled, drastically reducing the chance of recovering usable evidence. He signaled the 2 officers with him, Miller and Jacobs, to push everyone in the area back behind the wooden fence line and halt all amateur searching to prevent further damage. Once the crowd was cleared from the critical zone, Tucker established the initial search perimeter, a 50-meter radius from Amelia's last known location, extending further along the slope leading out of Maple Hollow Road. He used temporary rope and small wooden stakes to mark boundaries and had Miller log the time the perimeter was set in the scene log. The first area he examined was the lawn directly in front of the Reed house. Despite the disturbance, Tucker noticed one patch of grass pressed down harder than the rest, about a meter wide, likely where Amelia had been standing before the ball rolled away. He crouched down and studied the direction the blades were bent toward the curb, consistent with a small child running after a ball. At the curb, the spot where the red ball was recovered was marked with a small stake. Tucker observed closely. Grass slightly twisted, soil compressed in a small arc, typical of a round object rolling slowly to a stop. No scrape marks, drag marks, or signs of struggle. From there, he had Jacobs photograph the entire area, including the adjacent pavement and the narrow strip leading into the woods. While Jacobs set up the camera, Tucker examined the lightly traveled asphalt road. He found a faint tire skid more than 3 meters long, with slightly deeper edges than normal, suggesting the vehicle had stopped and then accelerated quickly. Since it hadn't rained, the road was dry, meaning the mark was likely made within the last hour. Tucker measured the track width and tread pattern, then had Miller collect soil samples from the grooves in paper bags for later comparison with suspect tires. A few centimeters beside the skid, he noticed a narrow strip of dirt and gravel, lightly disturbed in the direction of the main road, as if the car had sped off and flung stones aside. He recorded the exact location and cordoned the whole area with caution tape. Moving back from the road, Tucker called Betty Carson over to point out exactly where she last saw Amelia. The spot she indicated was about 3 meters from the lawn, near a small tree. Tucker checked the ground. Adult shoe prints overlaid some smaller ones. The smaller prints could be Amelia's, but they were too trampled to be sure. He had Jacobs pour plaster for 2 intact small shoe prints near the fence, short length, very likely Amelia's. While Jacobs worked on the casts, the K9 unit arrived. Tucker had Miller coordinate taking Amelia's jacket from Helen for the dogs to scent. He instructed the first search area to be the curb, the last place Amelia appeared to move naturally. While K9 prepared, Tucker finalized assignments. Miller continued collecting physical evidence around the yard. Jacobs handled detailed scene logging and photography. Tucker oversaw the big picture, coordination, and witness statements. He also directed a newly arrived officer to compile a list of everyone on Maple Hollow Road around 4 p.m. for screening. Known residents, strangers, anyone with no clear reason to be there. With the perimeter officially secured and tasks assigned, Tucker stepped back to take in the whole scene. A trampled lawn, a red ball under a marker, a faint tire track leading to the main road, and a chilling empty space where a 5-year-old girl had vanished in under a minute. The few traces that remained were now the only foundation. Tucker had to start piecing together what happened in that brief window of time. Once the scene was stable enough to avoid further contamination, he moved to the next phase. Initial witness statements. Tucker chose a spot near the Reed porch, far enough not to disturb the critical area, but close enough to clearly observe reactions, and called Helen first, since she was the last person to see Amelia before the disappearance. Her voice was still trembling and breaking, but Tucker needed every detail to establish the timeline. Helen said the afternoon had been completely normal. Amelia was kicking her ball in the front yard while she went inside for a cloth because her daughter's sleeves were dirty from playing. She insisted she was inside no more than a minute. The kitchen clock read about 4:03. When she stepped back onto the porch, Amelia wasn't where she usually played. She only saw Betty near the fence, looking confused and staring toward the curb. Helen ran straight to the ball Betty had just picked up, and instinctively started calling Amelia's name over and over. She admitted that before going inside, while Amelia was playing, she hadn't been watching constantly, so she didn't know if anyone or anything had approached. Helen heard no car engine revving, no screams, no running footsteps. The area had been quiet except for Amelia's laughter just before she went in. That helped Tucker establish that the abduction happened with zero audible warning or resistance. When he moved to Betty Carson's statement, Tucker kept her at a distance from the family to avoid emotional influence. Betty said that while Amelia was playing, she had been watching from her own yard because she was waiting for her mother to call her for chores. She remembered seeing a strange man at the end of the street, standing in the shade, wearing a fedora and dark coat. Betty never saw him walk toward the Reed yard. He just stood motionless for a few minutes, then disappeared from view when she turned away. Regarding the black Ford, she clearly recalled the engine cutting in and out like it was starving for gas. It was parked dozens of meters from the woods, and she was certain it started at least twice while she was watching. She didn't see anyone get in or out, and couldn't confirm whether it drove off exactly when Amelia vanished, because when she looked back from her porch, her attention was immediately on the fact that Amelia was no longer in the yard. Though there was no strong direct evidence, Betty's statement was valuable for providing two potential leads: the strange man and the black Ford. Tucker pressed Betty on the exact moment she turned away and looked back. She estimated 5 to 7 seconds, just long enough to answer her mother. But during that time she wasn't directly watching the edge of the yard. That brief gap matched Helen's time inside and created what Tucker noted as the observation blind spot. After both main statements, Tucker assessed reliability. Helen was heavily affected emotionally and might be off on time estimates. But her sequence of events was consistent. Betty was calmer and had no reason to distort facts, though her view was partially blocked by the fence, and she turned away at the critical moment, so her account didn't cover everything. Tucker had Jacobs transcribe the statements verbatim in chronological order and began a rough timeline with 4 key points: 1, 4:02, 4:03 p.m. Amelia still playing ball, Helen watching intermittently. 2, 4:03, 4:04 p.m. Helen steps inside for cloth. Amelia in yard, Betty watching. 3, 4:04, 4:05 p.m. Betty turns away for a few seconds. When she looks back, Amelia is gone. Ball at curb. 4, 4:05, 4:06 p.m. Helen comes out, discovers Amelia missing, calls Thomas. Neighbors start searching before police arrive. This timeline became the foundation for determining the narrow window in which the perpetrator approached and left. When finished, Tucker reviewed all notes. 2 statements with different key details, but converging on one fact: the disappearance happened in under a minute, in a spot that couldn't be hidden from view unless a vehicle or third party intervened. He wrote that conclusion into the report as the initial investigative basis before expanding to other scene elements. When Tucker finished establishing the initial rough timeline, the K9 unit was ready to deploy. The tracking dog was first allowed to scent from Amelia's jacket that Helen had brought out from the house, then led to the starting point in the middle of the lawn where Amelia had last been playing. As soon as it picked up the command scent, the dog began moving in a gentle arc around the yard, head constantly low to check the remaining scent trails among the many resident footprints. It paused near the base of the small tree, where Betty said she had seen Amelia run past, then broke away from the yard toward the road's edge. Tucker and Officer Miller followed, keeping their distance so as not to disturb the track. The dog stopped again right at the area where the ball had been found, sniffing around the flattened grass and the asphalt edge. After about 3 circles of checking, it suddenly lifted its head and pulled hard toward the main road, but the moment it reached the very edge of the pavement, it lost the trail completely, circling for a while, as if trying to regain it, but with no success. Miller reported to Tucker that the scent ended at a location consistent with the hypothesis that Amelia had left the ground there. Either lifted up or stepped into a vehicle. Tucker ordered the loss of scent point, marked with a wooden stake and caution tape, the coordinates logged, and both wide and close-up photographs taken for the record. After confirming the primary area had been surveyed, Tucker divided the search teams into 3 directions based on terrain within a 1-mile radius. The first team took the dense strip of trees and the narrow trail running parallel to Maple Woods. The second checked the lawns and backyards of the 5 nearest residences. The third followed the shallow ditch leading toward the secondary highway. Tucker chose to go with the first team because that route was the most likely to be overlooked if the perpetrator had walked a short distance before entering a vehicle. While moving along the forest edge, the team found a few patches of bent grass but nothing clear enough to determine direction. They could have been made by residents searching. There were no distinctive shoe prints or any child-related items. At the point where the woods met a small dirt road, Officer Jacobs called Tucker back to the area near the Turner family's fence, about 2 houses from the Reeds, because he had spotted something fairly conspicuous on the ground. A red and yellow fruit candy wrapper, lightly crumpled, lying beneath a layer of dry leaves. Jacobs noted that the item appeared to have been dropped recently because it was not yet damp and the colors were still bright. Moreover, that type of candy wrapper was not very common in the neighborhood. Tucker ordered it left in place, immediately photographed from 3 angles, then collected with tweezers into a paper evidence bag. He also marked the location with a small stake and recorded the distance from this spot to the road's edge, almost exactly matching the area where the K9 had lost the trail. McAllen, an officer from the second team, reported small footprints in one backyard, but they lacked clear definition, so Tucker logged it without drawing conclusions. The third team, walking the ditch, reported nothing beyond a few old bottles and household trash. After compiling reports from all 3 teams, Tucker saw that most indicators converged on the road leading to the paved road's edge, where the dog had stopped, and the location where the candy wrapper was found. He instructed Jacobs to divide the 1-mile radius map into 3 additional search rings, the innermost ring covering the Reed yard and the 5 neighboring homes, the middle ring consisting of the shallow woods and trails, the outermost ring encompassing the entire area leading to the main escape routes off Maple Hollow Road. The search was expanded along these 3 rings, each handled by a separate team of officers. However, despite meticulously sweeping each zone for nearly an hour, the search parties found no further direct traces related to Amelia, no clothing, no belongings, no drag marks. This drew Tucker's particular attention to the candy wrapper. Small as it was, its timing and location aligned too perfectly with the suspected path of movement. After completing the first full 1-mile radius sweep, Tucker ordered a halt to document everything collected into the preliminary scene report. Scent lost at the road's edge, no signs the child ran farther, no evidence of accident or fall into a hazardous area, and no additional physical evidence beyond the candy wrapper. These findings were agreed to indicate that if Amelia had left the yard on foot, the K9 would not have lost the trail so abruptly. If she had simply wandered off, there would most likely be a continuing direction of travel. Yet in reality, every trace stopped at a single point. Tucker concluded the 1-mile sweep by entering into the report, "Direction of travel terminates at the road's edge. High probability of vehicle involvement." Tucker returned to his patrol car, opened his notebook, and began reconstructing the entire sequence of events within the brief window from 4:03 to 4:09 p.m. The time frame established as the core of the disappearance. Using Helen's statement, Betty's statement, and the on-scene observations, he arranged each marker as accurately as possible, given the limited information. Tucker fixed the first marker at approximately 4:03 p.m. Amelia was still playing ball in the front yard, with no strangers approaching within Helen's or Betty's line of sight. This was the last moment both witnesses saw Amelia in a normal, free, and unaccompanied state. Just seconds later, around 4:03, 4:04 p.m., Helen left the yard to fetch a towel from the house, an absence estimated at 40 to 60 seconds. Tucker labeled this interval the start of the uncontrolled window. While Helen was inside, Betty continued watching Amelia from a distance, until she turned away for about 5 to 7 seconds to answer her mother. This was the marker Tucker noted as temporary loss of observation, critically important because it coincided with the moment the ball rolled toward the road. Tucker placed the second marker at exactly 4:04 p.m. The ball rolled down. Amelia ran after it. Betty momentarily turned her face from the yard. Based on the scene description and the ball's recovered location, Tucker determined Amelia's movement led straight to the road's edge, matching both Helen's and Betty's accounts. The third marker occurred around 4 hours, 4 minutes, and 30 seconds. 4:05 p.m. When Betty looked back, Amelia was no longer in the yard, and the ball was already at the asphalt edge. Betty recalled seeing no one enter the yard and hearing no unusual sounds. This led Tucker to label this the dead zone, when an abduction could have occurred undetected. The fourth marker was Helen returning to the porch around 4:05 p.m. Noticing Betty's odd expression, and upon stepping down to the yard, finding Amelia gone. From this point, Tucker established 4:05, 4:06 p.m. as when the family first realized something was wrong and reacted by calling out and enlisting neighbors. While working through the timeline markers, Tucker cross-referenced all K9 data. Amelia's scent ended abruptly at the road's edge, with no continuation toward the woods or the opposite direction. This allowed him to pinpoint the exact loss of scent location at the road's edge in front of the Reed house, perfectly matching both the ball's path and the flattened grass. When all information was combined, Tucker determined the incident window to be from 4:04 to 4 hours 5 minutes and 30 seconds p.m., less than 90 seconds total. Within that period, Amelia left the yard, reached the road's edge, made contact with the perpetrator for a few seconds, and vanished from the area before anyone looked again. With the time frame now relatively precise, Tucker began analyzing the three most common scenarios in child disappearances. First, Amelia left the area on her own. Second, an accident caused her to fall or become trapped in an obscured location. Third, she was approached and taken by a stranger or acquaintance. The first possibility was quickly ruled out because the K9 detected no continuing trail beyond the loss of scent point. If Amelia had kept running, wandered off, or moved freely, the dog would have followed the scent elsewhere. In reality, the scent vanished completely at the road's edge, proving she did not continue walking at that moment. The second possibility was eliminated after sweeping every potentially hazardous area within a 1-mile radius. Ditches, depressions, small caves, and shallow woods were all checked with no signs of accident. No clothing, shoes, hair, or scrape marks appeared. No sounds of falling or impact were reported by nearby residents. This reduced the accident scenario to near zero probability. The third possibility, abduction, became the most plausible hypothesis. The gap from when Betty turned away until she looked back was too short for a child to wander far on her own, yet long enough for an adult to approach from the road's edge, crouch or call the child closer, and quickly lift her into a vehicle or carry her away. The K9 losing the trail right at the pavement directly supported vehicle involvement. Tucker added reinforcing factors: the black Ford seen parked near the woods shortly before, the unusual engine sound, and the strange man Betty saw standing at the end of the road just minutes before Amelia vanished. Putting everything together, Tucker concluded the perpetrator, if there was one, approached Amelia in under 10 seconds and left the scene in less than 90 seconds after she chased the ball. He closed the notebook, writing beneath the preliminary timeline one critical line: extremely narrow approach and escape window. High probability the perpetrator had been watching the child beforehand. Immediately after finishing the timeline, Tucker turned his attention back to the faint tire impression he had noticed at the road's edge, the rare piece of evidence still relatively intact for analysis. He asked Jacobs to bring a measuring tape, a tire tread comparison board, and the technical files on common 1950s vehicle tires maintained by the Greensboro Police Department. The tire track on the pavement showed a double herringbone pattern with two main parallel grooves and secondary grooves angled slightly at about 45 degrees. Based on the measured tread width of approximately 5.8 inches, Tucker cross-referenced the data and narrowed it down to two likely tire models: Firestone Deluxe Champion and Goodyear Super Cushion, both commonly fitted on early 1950 s American sedans. When he combined pattern, width, and wear characteristics, Tucker became nearly certain the tire at the scene best matched the Firestone Deluxe Champion, the standard tire on Ford Custom Line models produced from 1953-1955. This aligned perfectly with Betty's statement about seeing a black Ford parked near the woods before Amelia disappeared. After identifying the tire type and probable Ford Custom Line vehicle, Tucker requested the Greensboro Police Administrative Division pull every registration record for black Ford Custom Lines in Guilford County. Although 1957 records were not yet computerized, paper files were organized by color code and license plate zone, making tracing feasible. After more than 40 minutes reviewing plates, colors, and registration years, Tucker received a list of 27 registered owners of black Ford Custom Lines in the county. He divided the 27 owners into three geographic groups relative to Maple Hollow Road. Group 1 contained 8 vehicles owned by people living within a 3-mile radius. Group 2 had 12 vehicles between 10 miles. Group 3 had 7 vehicles on the county's outer edges over 10 miles away. Group 1 was prioritized because a local perpetrator would tend to choose a familiar location close to home for easier surveillance and escape. Tucker then filtered Group 1 by each owner's criminal and behavioral background, checking 3 factors: prior convictions, complaints, neighbor disputes, and any previously documented unusual conduct. Of the 8 owners in Group 1, 5 were ordinary working people with clean records and verifiable work schedules. On the afternoon of May 14, one was confirmed at his job by coworkers, another claimed to be visiting relatives in Burlington that afternoon with no initial contradictions. The remaining 2 files caught Tucker's attention. First, a single man named Douglas Turner who lived just over 1 block from Maple Hollow Road and had been rumored to watch children playing in the park, though no formal reports existed. Second, Lester Cole, frequently described by Maple Hollow residents as the odd neighbor, living near the wooded lot where the black Ford was reportedly parked that afternoon. Cole owned a 1954 black Ford Custom Line that had never changed ownership. His record showed only 2 minor incidents, 1 noise complaint and 1 bar disturbance, but no convictions. What particularly flagged Cole was that his address was less than 600 meters as the crow flies from the scene, and neighbors had previously commented that he watched children play in a strange way. Tucker created a second, focused suspect list of 6 individuals out of the original 27 based on proximity to the scene, unusual behavior, unverified alibis, and local rumors. The 6 were ranked by suspicion level: high, Lester Cole and Douglas Turner; medium, 2 owners within 5 miles without confirmed alibis; low, 2 owners with no suspicious behavior but matching vehicles. Tucker directed Miller to compile individual dossiers on each person on the focused list, noting address, employment status that day, potential alibi witnesses, current vehicle condition, and any prior connection to the Maple Hollow area. At the same time, he instructed Jacobs to contact the vehicle registration office to check maintenance, repair, or tire replacement records for these vehicles within the past 3 months, to see if any had recently changed tires or showed unusual travel patterns. After finishing the sorting, Tucker gathered all lists, marking each entry with priority symbols in preparation for the next phase, systematically checking, verifying, and cross-referencing each person on the focused suspect list to determine whether the Ford Custom Line seen near the scene belonged to one of them. Tucker moved to the next step immediately after narrowing the vehicle owners, canvassing every residence in the immediate vicinity of the scene. Maple Hollow Road and its 2 short side streets contained a total of 21 households, most long-term residents, who knew each other and the neighborhood's daily rhythm well. Tucker split the officers into 2 teams, one knocking on doors heading west along Maple Hollow, the other covering the row of houses closest to the woods on the east side. He chose to personally interview the homes nearest the center of events, where observation chances were highest. The first house belonged to the Carson family, Betty's home. But since Betty had already given her statement, Tucker only needed quick confirmation that Mrs. Carson heard her daughter call out while working in the kitchen, matching the moment Betty turned away for a few seconds. The second house, the Turners, was 2 doors from the Reeds. Mrs. Turner said she was watering plants in the backyard around 4 o'clock and heard an engine start twice, which she assumed was a neighbor's car idling roughly. When asked the direction, she pointed toward the wooded side, matching where Betty placed the black Ford. Mr. Turner reported seeing a figure walking along the curb between 3:50 and 3:55 p.m., but could not describe him clearly due to distance. Tucker noted this, but rated reliability medium since it fell outside the critical 403-405 window. The third house belonged to the elderly Simmons couple. Mrs. Simmons said she heard children laughing and a ball bouncing on grass shortly before 4 o'clock, followed by an unusually long silence. She heard no screams or impacts. When asked about the black car, she recalled seeing one driving very slowly on Maple Hollow Road at noon, but was unsure if it was the same vehicle from the afternoon. The fourth house, the Grangers, sat close to the road with a wide view. Mr. Granger was in his garage repairing a lawnmower around 4 o'clock and heard an engine rev sharply as if the driver floored it to start quickly. He remembered the sound lasting a few seconds before fading toward the main road. Regarding suspicious people, he saw no one specific, but mentioned a strange man walking in the area early that morning, not a local. The fifth house, the Hollises, reported seeing nothing because they were indoors with windows closed. The sixth, Mr. Reeves, heard an engine, but thought it was his son's car and paid no further attention. From the 7th through 10th houses, statements were mostly the same. Nothing seen or heard. However, the 11th house, the Jacobs family, provided noteworthy information. Their 8-year-old son said he saw the black car near the woods while playing in the yard before his mother called him inside. Though children's descriptions are often imprecise, Tucker logged it and marked it possibly relevant. After interviewing all 21 households, Tucker organized the statements by 3 criteria: time of observation, vantage point, and degree of alignment with scene evidence. Mrs. Turner's and Mr. Granger's statements were ranked high reliability because they directly involved vehicle sounds during the exact critical window. Statements from homes that heard or saw nothing were logged as neutral, neither confirming nor ruling out. Statements from children or people uncertain about timing were ranked lowest, but retained for future cross-checking. When collating everything, one prominent inconsistency emerged. Several people heard an engine, but no one actually saw a vehicle leave via Maple Hollow Road itself. This led Tucker to consider the possibility that the car used the forest trail or a side road connecting to the highway instead of the T-fo Bolfernitude, then Stardio, turning back onto the main street. Another inconsistency involved the strange man Betty described a man in a fedora at the end of the road, while Mr. Granger and Mr. Turner each saw a walking figure, but at different times. When combined, it was impossible to confirm whether it was the same person. Nevertheless, Tucker noted that the appearance of an unknown man shortly before the disappearance was too significant a coincidence to ignore. Upon completing the analysis, Tucker closed his notebook, highlighting the 2 elements mentioned most often by residents: the black Ford and the presence of an unidentified man. These would become the 2 parallel investigative tracks moving forward. Tucker shifted his entire focus to the most prominent suspect on the list, Lester Cole. Initial data from neighbors and administrative records showed that Lester was the only person living within a few hundred meters of the scene, owned the exact make and model of car that needed to be checked, and had irregularities in his social behavior. Verifying Lester's background became the top priority. Lester Cole, 38 years old, lived alone in an old wooden house right on the edge of the forest east of Maple Hollow Road. Police department records showed he had moved to the area 4 years earlier, worked part-time as a mechanic, had no serious criminal record, but had been cited twice for minor disorderly conduct in 1955 and 1956. Some neighbors had complained that Lester hung around the playground or stood motionless at the roadside, watching children, though no formal reports had ever been filed. Tucker flagged Lester's file with a high suspicion code, not only because of these signs, but also because his address was less than a 5-minute walk from where the black Ford had been seen. The first thing Tucker did was verify where Lester had been during the afternoon of the disappearance. Tucker and Miller arrived at Lester's house just before 6 p.m. The house was dark. The front door was closed but unlocked. Tucker knocked, announced himself, and asked Lester to come out and talk. After a moment, Lester appeared in the doorway, thin-build, wearing a rumpled old shirt. When Tucker asked what he had been doing around 4 p.m., Lester said he wasn't sure, just that he had been home resting and cleaning the garage. That answer immediately put Tucker on alert, because it was too vague and had no witness to back it up. When Tucker asked whether Lester had heard any noises or children playing outside, he replied that his house was too far from that area and he didn't pay attention to other people's business. When asked about the Ford Custom Line registered in his name, Lester said the car hadn't run in months and had been sitting in the garage. However, when Tucker asked to see it, Lester hesitated for a few seconds before agreeing. That brief pause was noted by Tucker. People usually pause when they need time to think or to hide something. Tucker followed Lester around to the back of the house to a small garage with a rusty tin roof. The garage door was opened, and there sat the black Ford Custom Line, dusty but not nearly as dusty as Lester had claimed. Tucker looked closely. The dust on the hood was fairly thick, but the mud caked on the wheels was uneven, as if the car had been driven recently, but not far from soft dirt. Tucker knelt to examine the tread. The tires were Firestone Deluxe Champions, an exact match for the prints left at the scene. He measured the tread width with a ruler and recorded the match in his notebook. He asked Lester when the car had last been started. Lester said it had been out of service since last winter, and he couldn't remember the last time he had turned it over. That answer raised more suspicion, because if the car truly hadn't moved in that long, the dust on all 4 tires should be uniform. In reality, the right front tire appeared to have noticeably fresher dust than the others. When Tucker asked whether Lester had any alibi for the time Amelia disappeared, Lester said no one had been with him and he didn't need to explain himself to anyone. The uncooperative tone, combined with the inconsistencies in his timeline, kept Lester firmly in the prime suspect slot. Still, to complete the assessment, Tucker asked Lester to confirm the route he would take if he ever drove out of Maple Hollow Road. Lester gave an evasive answer that since the car couldn't move, he never thought about going anywhere. Tucker didn't argue, but noted Lester's tendency to answer indirectly or dodge the core of the question. After leaving the garage, Tucker jotted down basic observations about the house. The back door was locked, but the windows had no curtains. The interior was messy, but showed no signs that a small child had ever been inside. Still, Tucker found no direct evidence linking Lester at that point. Only the suspicious tire match, the geographic proximity, and statements that were hard to verify. Back in the car, Tucker discussed Lester's current suspicion level with Miller. They agreed that Lester could not prove an alibi, gave inconsistent answers, owned a car that matched the tire tracks at the scene, and lived close to where the black Ford had been spotted. Those factors were enough for Lester to be officially placed on the primary suspect list for further cross-checking. Tucker updated the file. No alibi. Matching vehicle, vague, timeline. Suspicion level, high. Information on Lester Cole was still insufficient for Tucker to reach any conclusion, but statements from neighbors strongly suggested the perpetrator had left Maple Hollow Road by car. While Tucker continued reviewing the county suspect list, the dispatcher reported new information from Spartanburg County, South Carolina, about 95 miles from Greensboro. An attendant at a highway gas station on US 221 said he had seen a little girl who looked very much like Amelia on the day of the disappearance. Tucker immediately requested the full call content and the informant's details be forwarded to command, then personally called the gas station attendant to verify particulars. The informant was Charles Duffy, 44, working the evening shift at Whitaker's Fuel and Service. Duffy said that around 7 p.m. on the day Amelia vanished, a black Ford, he guessed mid-1950s, pulled in for gas. What stuck with him wasn't the car but the two people who got out, a middle-aged woman with dark curly hair and a 5 or 6-year-old girl with blonde hair who looked frightened. Tucker asked Duffy to describe them in more detail. According to Duffy, the little girl stayed glued to the woman as if being held there, didn't say a word, and the woman seemed tense, answering curtly whenever he tried small talk. When Tucker asked if he remembered the license plate, Duffy apologized. He didn't, but said the plate had a light blue background, most likely South Carolina or North Carolina. Notably, Duffy stressed that the car seemed to stall once before pulling away, which immediately reminded Tucker of Betty's description of the uneven running engine near the woods. Tucker wrote down every detail, then instantly cross-checked the travel feasibility from Greensboro to Spartanburg. On 1957 maps, the shortest route was US 29, or US 220, connecting to local roads into South Carolina. Distance roughly 95 to 105 miles, averaging 2.5 to 3 hours, depending on speed and vehicle condition. If the perpetrator left Greensboro between 4:06 and 4:10 p.m., right after Amelia disappeared, arriving in Spartanburg around 7 p.m., was entirely possible. Tucker marked this as matches timeline, a crucial piece, because it fit the established chronology perfectly. He then asked Duffy to describe the little girl's demeanor more closely. Duffy said she wasn't crying but looked scared, eyes down at the ground, and stayed extremely close to the woman. It felt off to him because most kids with a parent or relative usually talk or ask questions. Regarding the woman, Duffy said she was about 45-50, wearing a dark cardigan sweater, and seemed in a big hurry. She only stood outside long enough for the gas and didn't go into the store to buy anything. Tucker asked about the payment method. Duffy said the woman paid cash, a common detail for the era, but still recorded in case it matched other evidence later. After obtaining the initial description, Tucker asked Duffy to sign a formal statement and requested a copy of the day's fuel receipts. Duffy explained the station only recorded total gallons sold per shift, not individual customers, but he agreed to look for any receipts left near the pumps. While the attendant searched, Tucker asked Greensboro PD dispatch to contact Spartanburg PD to send a local unit to check for any traffic cameras, if they existed, or question evening shift workers at nearby businesses. However, Tucker knew the chances of finding cameras in 1957 were practically zero since public surveillance systems barely existed. His focus therefore remained on gathering as many witnesses as possible. A little later, Duffy came back on the line saying he had found a receipt stub discarded near the station's trash can. He wasn't sure it was related since it had no customer name. Tucker still asked for a photograph to be sent for the file. The receipt showed 5.3 gallons of premium at 7:02 p.m., exactly matching Duffy's remembered time. Tucker immediately linked this to a 1953-55 Ford Custom Line's typical 17-gallon tank and 12-15 mpg consumption. Leaving Greensboro with a normal tank, after a 3-hour roughly 100-mile drive, adding 5.3 gallons made perfect sense. This was the second confirmation fuel consumption matched. Tucker then instructed the Greensboro support team to pull records of all Ford Custom Line owners who could have traveled that far that afternoon. If Lester Cole was involved, he would have had to leave his house right after 4 o'clock, drive nonstop to South Carolina, and appear at the station at 7 o'clock. Tucker labeled this hypothesis plausible but requires verification. Ending the call with the gas station, Tucker compiled the data description of the girl matched, description of the car matched, arrival time matched, fuel amount matched. Though it couldn't yet be confirmed as Amelia, this was the first solid lead on an escape route out of Greensboro, enough to expand the investigation into South Carolina. Immediately after synthesizing the Spartanburg gas station information, Tucker decided to pause outward tracing into neighboring states and instead review the entire first 24-hour response process, because he recognized that any procedural mistake at this stage could lose critical evidence or create gaps that would derail the investigation. Tucker began by re-examining the initial scene response, arrival time of patrol units, number of civilians who had already searched before the perimeter was sealed, degree of grass disturbance, perimeter radius, and accuracy of witness statements. He noted that by the time the first patrol car arrived, at least 10 neighbors had walked through the key area, trampling potential prints. This made some small footprints impossible to distinguish as Amelia's or a neighbor's. He marked Error 1, failure to seal the scene quickly enough. Tucker continued checking collected evidence. The candy wrapper had been properly bagged, but he realized the initial team had not thoroughly examined the leaf litter and vegetation within 2 meters of the road edge before civilians arrived. That created a high risk of missing small valuable items. Error 2, the 2-meter roadside buffer zone was not checked before civilian contact. Reviewing crime scene photos, Tucker noticed another issue. A small patch of ground right at the tree line that Jacobs had not photographed from all 3 required angles. When asked, Jacobs said he had been pulled away by other demands and assumed Miller had taken it. That left one corner of the scene potentially without initial photographic record. He then reviewed written statements. While flipping through Helen and Betty's interviews, he discovered a troubling detail. The duty officer's handwritten log mentioned a sound like a car door opening around 4 o'clock, yet that detail never made it into the consolidated report. Tucker called the duty officer to confirm. The officer said he had heard Helen mention it, but because she was crying and he couldn't hear clearly, he decided it wasn't reliable. This was a serious error. Any vehicle-related sound could directly affect the investigation direction. Error 3. Discarding a key detail without cross-verification. Tucker continued checking the witness interview list. 21 households had been canvassed, but when he cross-referenced the area map, he realized the Elkins house near the turn-perfect sightline straight down Maple Hollow was not on the list. When he asked the canvassing officer, the man said he had knocked but no one was home, and he never followed up. Error 4. Strategic household, not recontacted. While reviewing the entire paper file, Tucker spotted something suspicious. The section Unusual Vehicle Activity noted before 4 p.m. contained only one short line, despite 3 separate households describing unusual engine noises. This suggested inconsistency in report compilation. He checked the original logs in the command vehicle and discovered pages numbered 7A, 8A, and 12B were missing from the master file, all from the first hour after the disappearance. When he asked every member of the initial team if anyone had them or had pulled them for separate processing, no one admitted to it. Error 5. Initial note pages missing, reason unknown, possibly containing early mentions of the man in the hat or the black Ford. Continuing, Tucker reviewed the timing of the reported revving engine, Granger's statement. It was noted in a pocket notebook but never transferred to the main report. When asked, Jacobs admitted he omitted it because he felt it wasn't specific enough. Error 6. Subjective judgment caused loss of sound data matching the critical time frame. To complete the review, Tucker compiled a full list of issues requiring follow-up. 1 delayed scene lockdown. 2 failure to check leaf litter at road edge before civilian access. 3 missing, third-angle photos. 4 omitted car door sound. 5 Elkins household, not re-interviewed. 6 3 missing note pages. 7 2 key details, absent from consolidated report. He closed the notebook and added a critical observation. Initial errors impact accuracy of timeline and suspect scope. These notes were flagged in red for immediate reprocessing in the next review phase. After finishing the initial procedure review, Tucker returned to the temporary command post in front of the Reed house to monitor the family's condition. Knowing their psychological state not only affected the reliability of their statements, but also helped evaluate whether an acquaintance abduction angle needed consideration. Helen was now exhausted after hours of searching and answering questions. She sat on the porch steps, hands clasped tightly, eyes red, staring constantly toward the road edge, as if Amelia might appear at any moment. Tucker had observed Helen's reactions throughout the day, initially panicked and out of control, then withdrawn and repeating meaningless questions about when she had stepped away from the yard. The extreme emotional swings led Tucker to note that she was not stable enough for detailed follow-up questioning at that time. Thomas was different. He tried to stay calm, repeatedly asking police what they needed, whom to contact, and how he could help find his daughter. However, Tucker detected repressed tension in Thomas's responses, especially when asked about acquaintances or relatives who had contact with Amelia. Whenever the possibility of an acquaintance abduction, a hypothesis always considered in rapid child disappearances, was raised, Thomas denied it immediately, sometimes almost too forcefully. Tucker did not treat this as direct suspicion, but noted he would need to recheck family history, relatives, and anyone recently close to Amelia or in and out of the house. Meanwhile, neighbors had gathered in small clusters around the Reed yard, some comforting Helen, others debating who the stranger in the neighborhood might have been that week. Those conversations unintentionally added pressure on the family. Helen overheard remarks like, "Probably someone the kid knew," or "sometimes it's family," causing her to grip Thomas's hand tightly and shake her head repeatedly, refusing to believe anyone in their circle could be involved. Tucker decided to ask her a few gentle questions to see if the family had any internal conflicts or personal relationships that might become leads. Helen replied that they had no disputes, no debts, and Amelia had no one close enough that she would have gone willingly, without protest. When asked about past babysitters or recent visitors, she briefly listed a few trusted neighbors, none of whom raised red flags. Still, Tucker did not entirely dismiss the possibility. In many child abduction cases, the perpetrator is someone familiar to the parents, or at least familiar with the area. He simply recorded it for later verification. Paul, the 2-year-old, could not give a statement, but Tucker noted his reactions anyway. Paul clung to his mother more than usual, cried every time Helen stood up, and kept looking toward the yard, as if searching for someone. Tucker had no expectations from a child that young, but the observation was mechanically recorded because it might support the timeline Helen gave regarding when she left the yard. When Tucker returned to the command vehicle to debrief with Miller and Jacobs, the topic was whether to broaden the investigation toward an acquaintance angle. Jacobs argued there were no signs of violence or struggle, and children usually only approach someone they feel safe with. Miller leaned toward the idea that the perpetrator had been watching Amelia beforehand, because a successful approach in mere seconds is rarely random coincidence. Tucker analyzed that although the stranger abduction theory remained strongest, supported by tire tracks, the black Ford sighting, and the gas station description, the possibility that the perpetrator had prior contact with the family or had appeared around Maple Hollow Road under innocent cover could not be ruled out. However, when all the day's data was totaled, Tucker recorded that the Reed family was fully cooperative, showed no signs of concealment, had no notable internal conflicts, and had provided no prepared falsehoods about the timeline. Their cooperation, combined with hours of visible shock, led Tucker to rule out direct family involvement. The acquaintance from outside the immediate family, possibility, someone who had done work at the house, a visitor, or in frequent contact, remained open. Before closing the evaluation, Tucker wrote in his notebook, "Family stable, cooperative. No indication of involvement, extreme psychological stress. Continue emotional support and obtain supplemental statements as needed." Tucker entered 1958, hoping the scattered traces from the first year would lead to a new breakthrough. But when he compiled every clue in the file, nothing formed a clear enough logical chain to identify a perpetrator or confirm that Amelia was still in the area. He reviewed every detail again: the tire tracks at the roadside that matched Firestone Deluxe Champion tires, the black Ford Custom line that multiple witnesses either heard or saw, the unidentified man in a fedora, the candy wrapper discarded under the leaves, the Spartanburg gas station attendant who saw a little girl resembling Amelia with a strange woman, and suspect Lester Cole, whose vehicle matched but who lacked an alibi. Yet, as Tucker went through the file item by item, he recognized the common weakness: there was no direct physical evidence linking any of the clues together, and each piece existed only in a state of possibly related, but unconfirmable. As a result, the investigative unit opened another phase, screening 3 new suspects based on 1958 citizen reports of older Ford vehicles moving suspiciously near Greensboro. The first suspect was a light truck driver named Raymond Slocum, previously arrested for drunk driving. Slocum owned a black 1951 vehicle, but it was not a custom line, and his tire tread did not match the scene. When Tucker asked about his whereabouts on the day Amelia vanished, Slocum provided a solid alibi through his store employer. The second suspect, Joseph Hardwick, was a delivery worker whose route passed through Greensboro, but his company log showed detailed schedules proving he never traveled Maple Hollow Road that day. The third suspect was a Randolph County man named Donald Shepard, reported for loitering at public playgrounds. However, Shepard owned no vehicle matching the description and was documented 40 miles away in another town at the exact time of the disappearance. All 3 were quickly cleared. In 1959, Tucker continued to pursue the South Carolina lead, the only one involving a reported sighting of a blonde girl mentioned by a witness. Greensboro PD worked with the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office to check every family that had newly taken in or fostered a child in the month following the disappearance, but none matched Amelia's description. Schools, churches, and hospitals in Spartanburg were also searched. No records matched the missing girl's age or appearance. Some area stores re-interviewed night shift employees from that date, but most either had no memory of the incident or had never noticed anything. Another lead was sent to Tennessee after Knoxville police reported a woman, a blonde girl, and a man seen together in a black car at a roadside store. When Tucker requested more detail, the witness said the girl appeared 7 or 8 years old, 2 or 3 years older than Amelia would have been, and the car was described as a Ford Fairlane, not a custom line. That lead was promptly discarded. By the end of 1959, the case file had grown heavy with repetitive, vague reports. Every sighting of a black car in some town made the public think it was a trail to Amelia, but when Tucker cross-referenced plates and models, most proved unrelated. He sorted the data into categories: tires that didn't match the tread, vehicles from different model years, cars not in the area at the relevant time, or owners with airtight alibis. Throughout this period, Tucker kept close tabs on Lester Cole. He remained the only person without an alibi whose vehicle matched, but repeated searches of Cole's garage and home turned up nothing new. No children's clothing, belongings, or traces. The Ford in his garage could not be conclusively tied to the scene's tire marks because the impressions were too faint for a one-to-one match. Everything stayed at the level of suspicion, with no further progress. At the end of 1959, Tucker requested Highway Patrol assistance to cross-check every gas station along the Greensboro-Spartanburg route for the date of the disappearance. Most stations, however, did not keep individual customer receipts, only total gallons sold per shift, so verifying travel relied entirely on fading witness memory. In 1960, the active investigation officially went cold. The initial search teams had long returned to regular duties. Tips dropped sharply. Most new information was unverifiable or irrelevant. Tucker realized the case was slipping from community attention because no concrete results had emerged. The Reed family's pain remained, but the chance of finding Amelia grew ever fainter. In his summary report for that period, Tucker wrote a short but heavy sentence: no new leads. All investigative avenues exhausted. Probability of removal from the state considered high. but destination cannot be determined. The investigation continued, yet at an ever-slowing pace, like a machine running on momentum alone, lacking fuel and any footing to move forward. By 1963, after nearly 6 years pursuing Amelia Reed's disappearance with no new traces, the Greensboro Police Department formally reviewed the entire file to determine the case's legal status. An internal meeting was held with the investigative unit commander, patrol division representatives, the prosecutor's office, and Sergeant Tucker, the officer who had lived with the case from day one. Reports from 1957 to 1962 showed every avenue had been explored: vehicle checks, witness canvassing, FBI traces, coordination with South Carolina and Tennessee, reviews of children newly placed in care facilities or churches, even surveillance of single men living near the woods bordering Maple Hollow. Yet not one effort produced concrete evidence. No new physical items, no additional witnesses, no matching missing child reports from neighboring states, only prolonged silence. During the meeting, the unit commander asked Tucker directly, "Is there any proactive avenue we can still pursue that we haven't already tried?" After reviewing all data once more, Tucker had to answer no. New leads in the past 3 years, zero. Forensic technology of the era was too limited, and every passing year further blurred witness memories, reducing the chance of accurate reconstruction. With those factors, Command made the heavy but unavoidable decision: active investigation would be suspended, the case reclassified as inactive, and officially moved to cold case status. Tucker was tasked with finalizing the file for archiving. He gathered every document, initial notes, scene reports, statements from 21 households, suspect lists, tire tread analysis, South Carolina route maps, and the few scattered receipts from Spartanburg, and organized them into 4 large binders. 3 missing pages of notes were never recovered and had to be marked permanently lost. An internal memo Tucker attached at the end read, "Nothing rules out the possibility. Amelia is still alive. Current data is insufficient to identify a perpetrator or the victim's location." When the file was officially closed, it was moved to Greensboro PD storage, a large room with 3-tier metal shelves, where hundreds of unsolved cases sat silently in cardboard boxes. Amelia Reed's file was placed in Row E, Aisle 12, Box 4. The case number was marked in light blue to distinguish it from violent crimes or homicides. Throughout 1963 and the years immediately following, the case received only minimal monitoring. Any stray tip was logged in a small notebook. But most were unreliable or unrelated. Calls from citizens claiming to have seen a girl who looked like Amelia grew rare, and nearly all were mistakes or based on faulty memory. The Maple Hollow community gradually returned to normal life, though Amelia's name still surfaced occasionally in neighborhood conversations. The Reed family carried their loss quietly, and Tucker, despite being assigned new cases, always felt this file like a stone he had never managed to lift from his shoulders. But under the procedures of that era, when no new leads appeared for more than 5 years, a case had to be moved to cold status and could only be reopened with new evidence, a new witness, or data strong enough to justify reactivation. And so, from 1963 onward, Amelia Reed was no longer an active investigation. It became a dormant file in the shadows of Greensboro PD storage, waiting for something different enough to change everything. After Amelia Reed's disappearance was reclassified as a cold case in 1963, the few remaining items of physical evidence were sealed and stored with the paper file. Among them, the small wooden bead necklace Amelia wore on her last day was the only personal belonging of the child preserved in a dedicated evidence envelope. The necklace had been handmade by Helen for Amelia's 5th birthday, 14 round wooden beads strung on soft cotton cord. When collected, it was intact, no breaks or deformation, indicating Amelia left the yard without violent struggle. DNA testing did not yet exist in any usable form. Officers simply noted the necklace as an identifying item, mainly for future comparison if a body or related object was ever found. Still, Tucker, though he could not fully foresee the future, requested it be stored under a separate evidence code rather than in ordinary paper bags. He noted that the soft fabric cord might retain skin cells, and the wooden beads might hold sweat residue or fingerprints. This was a decision ahead of standard practice, born from an investigator's instinct after seeing too many cases lacking personal items for comparison. The necklace was sealed in a wax-lined envelope, placed in a small box with related items, crime scene photos, the candy wrapper, and 3 plaster casts from the lawn, and stored in the Greensboro PD cold room, where stable temperature prevented the fabric from rotting. Over the years, while the case file gathered no new data, the necklace lay untouched, except for routine procedural checks. In 1970, after Helen Reed began showing serious heart disease symptoms, she asked to meet Tucker again. During a brief visit at the house, she inquired about the status of the evidence and the file, especially Amelia's necklace. Though Tucker could not return the item, legally prohibited, he showed Helen a photograph of it and assured her it remained perfectly preserved. Helen lightly touched the photo as if it were the real thing and asked that, when she passed away, if regulations ever allowed, the necklace be given to Paul, the family's remaining child. Tucker recorded the request under special family notes in the file, but explained it could only happen once the case was no longer under investigation and after forensic clearance. In 1975, Helen died. Paul, then 20, received some of his sister's old belongings, photographs, childhood clothes, and a note from their mother. After multiple procedural confirmations, Tucker requested the necklace be released to Paul as personal property no longer of direct investigative value. The forensic unit required the seal be broken in the presence of 2 officers and resealed afterward for records. When the wax envelope was opened, the necklace looked exactly the same, only slightly darker with age. Paul took it with both hands, trembling slightly. He had been only 2 when Amelia vanished and remembered little of her, but the necklace became the only tangible way he could feel his sister's existence. He kept it in a small wooden box he always safeguarded, like a family heirloom. Tucker retained copies, scene photos, necklace photos, and physical description for the evidence archive. Though the necklace itself was returned to the family, the file still noted that the item retained potential for future microscopic examination, if technology permits. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, as reports about biotechnology and protein testing emerged, Tucker, nearing retirement, occasionally reviewed Amelia's file and added a forward-looking line. If DNA becomes a standard forensic tool, the necklace could be key, if resubmitted for testing. That note would later be regarded as one of the most prescient entries in the entire file. Paul grew up, married, and always kept the necklace locked in a drawer. He never let anyone wear it, never exposed it to water, sun, or anything that could damage the materials, unwittingly helping preserve whatever skin cells remained on the cord and beads. By the late 1980s, after reading newspaper articles about new DNA techniques, Paul began to wonder if the necklace might mean more than just a keepsake. At that time, however, DNA testing was reserved for serious crimes with relatively fresh samples. A 20-plus-year-old necklace was not a priority. Still, Amelia's file continued to list under evidence, DNA examination potential exists, not yet accessible. And so the necklace, the smallest piece of evidence in the case, lived on through decades as a fragment of memory that had kept its shape, waiting for the moment when time and technology would finally catch up to its true value. From the early 1970s through the end of the 1990s, the disappearance of Amelia Reed gradually faded from the orbit of official investigation, but persisted stubbornly in the collective memory of the Greensboro community, especially in the Maple Hollow Road neighborhood. With no new leads emerging, peripheral stories began to form and were exaggerated with each retelling. Tucker, though he had moved on to other cases, periodically reviewed the notes on rumors and civilian reports to ensure no genuine clue was overlooked. However, as time passed, the tips became increasingly unrealistic and mostly reflected the community's lingering skepticism or obsession. One of the most widespread rumors emerged in the early 1970s and concerned the woods bordering Maple Hollow. Several local teenagers claimed they had seen the figure of a blonde little girl running across a trail at dusk. When Tucker interviewed each group, they admitted they had only heard it from someone else, and none were direct eyewitnesses. Though baseless, the rumors spread widely and prompted some families in the area to demand another police search of the woods. That search turned up nothing except fresh footprints from curious locals. By the late 1970s, another rumor surfaced that a strange man who once lived near Maple Hollow, possibly Lester Cole, had taken a child to a small town in Virginia. The story originated from a conversation between two elderly residents, but when police followed up, they discovered it stemmed from mistaken identity, and there was no evidence Lester had left Greensboro with a young child at that time. Lester continued living alone in his old house until the end of 1978, when he left the area without providing a forwarding address, which only fueled more speculation about him. Lacking official information, the Maple Hollow community kept filling the void with speculative tales. In 1982, residents reported seeing a blonde girl with a woman at a supermarket near Greensboro. Police arrived and quickly determined it was a mother and daughter who had recently moved from another state. The report was closed in under an hour. In 1985, an anonymous caller claimed to have seen a girl resembling Amelia on television in a children's program. Tucker checked and confirmed the child was an actor's daughter with no connection. In every such instance, police logged the report procedurally but did not reopen the formal investigation. Toward the late 1980s, a new rumor circulated that Amelia might have been sold to a wealthy family through an unregistered adoption. This was a period when national media heavily covered illegal adoptions and children moved across state lines without paperwork, causing the Maple Hollow community to link those stories to Amelia's case. Tucker, though no longer the lead investigator, still reviewed every tip and noted, no federal or state records from 1957, 1975 matched the description of Amelia Reed. At the end of the 1980s, another rumor claimed Amelia might be alive in a closed religious facility in Tennessee. When Greensboro PD contacted local authorities there, they confirmed the facility had never taken in any children from North Carolina and had not accepted children in the 1950s. The information was fully dismissed. Over these 2 decades, reports added to the Amelia Reed file gradually became brief entries, unverified sighting, mistaken identity, third-hand information, speculative report. None provided a verifiable location, time, witness, or description specific enough for thorough follow-up. When Tucker retired in 1989, he handed over all these supplementary materials with a short note, no genuinely new investigative data since 1960. The rumors reflect community obsession rather than case developments. Through the late 1980s and the entire 1990s, the Amelia Reed case lived on as dinner table stories, whispers in stores, and conversations as people passed the old Reed house. But those persistent tales produced no objective evidence. From a legal and investigative standpoint, the case remained stalled, silent, lacking evidence, lacking fresh traces, and continued as one of Greensboro PD's longest-running cold cases, with no clear progress over those 2 decades. In 1995, nearly 4 decades after Amelia Reed vanished, the case, long buried in Greensboro PD's cold case archives, suddenly drew attention again when investigative reporter Susan Harrow of the Greensboro Sentinel requested access to the files under North Carolina's Freedom of Information Act. Harrow was a veteran journalist who specialized in old cases and overlooked traces in the justice system. She had followed numerous missing child cases from the 1960s and 1970s, and Amelia stood out because of its unusually prolonged silence. It took Greensboro PD almost 2 weeks to assemble the 4 aging volumes stored under Code 57 IR. Harrow was allowed to review the complete files in the archives room under the supervision of a records officer, on condition that she could not remove physical evidence or copy still redacted personal information. On the very first day, Harrow read the 1957 summary report, initial statements, crime scene diagrams, and the expanded investigation into South Carolina. When she reached the volume on suspect Lester Cole, she noticed the initial interview report at his home seemed disjointed. Some questions in Tucker's transcript referred to Lester's hesitation about letting officers search the garage, but the detailed description of his specific behavior was missing from the file. The page numbering jumped from 12 to 12C, skipping 12A and 12B, the exact 3 pages Tucker had noted years earlier as missing in an error log. When she asked the supervising officer, she was told the files had been preserved in their original state for decades. If pages were absent, they had been lost at the time of archiving. That answer only deepened her suspicion. In Tucker's marginal notes, one faint line near the edge read, "This detail requires further verification regarding access route." Yet there was no attachment or any page describing the relevant content. Harrow circled these points in her personal notebook and began questioning whether deliberate editing or procedural mishandling had occurred during decades of cold storage compilation. In the following days, as she dug deeper, Harrow noticed a section in the 1958-1959 reports that investigators at the time had briefly considered a list of unregistered religious organizations and child placement facilities in North and South Carolina. The section was thin, just a few summary lines, but contained a striking passage. Some children were transferred without legal process in the north-south border region. It was marked insufficient data, yet Harrow saw an eerie match with the illegal adoption rings exposed in the 1990s across several southern states. She decided to focus on that angle. Reviewing statements about the black Ford, especially the account of the middle-aged woman with a little girl at the Spartanburg gas station, Harrow began wondering whether Amelia's disappearance might be linked to an adoption broker or a network moving children out of state for placement with other families. Tucker's reports had heavily emphasized the man in the hat, or Lester Cole, as the likely abductor. Harrow, however, spotted an underexplored detail. The gas station attendant described the woman as the one controlling the situation while the girl stayed close to her. That did not fully fit the violent stranger abduction model. It resembled a coerced but non-violent removal. Harrow added this to her list of elements deviating from the original hypothesis. On another day in the archives, while examining 1959 statistical records of children admitted to private care facilities without proper paperwork, Harrow noted a timing coincidence. Exactly 1 month after Amelia vanished, 2 facilities reported receiving temporarily placed children without birth records or original documents. Although the names did not match Amelia, it suggested a shadow system of illegal placements existed in the region at that time. With these scattered pieces in front of her, Harrow began drafting notes on the possibility that Amelia's case was not a random abduction, but a link in an unregistered interstate child transfer chain. When she raised the idea with her newspaper's legal department, they required further verification before publication, since in 1995, many legal restrictions still protected adoption organizations and local religious groups. Harrow returned to the archives for one final session that week, this time focusing on crime scene photographs for any clues about vehicle movement. Enlarging tire track images, she discovered the tread pattern matched a type commonly used on Ford vehicles operated by private adoption facilities for transporting children during that era. There was no direct proof, but Harrow flagged it as a meaningful coincidence worth pursuing. All these findings convinced her that the Amelia Reed case contained far more gray areas than the police had ever publicly acknowledged. She ended the week with a key note in her notebook: missing pages, primary suspect not fully clarified, middle-aged woman data underdeveloped. Need to consider the existence of an illegal child transfer network in the 1950s context. For the first time in decades, Someone outside law enforcement was seriously asking whether this disappearance might not be the act of a lone individual, but part of a more complex structure. In the early 2000s, Greensboro PD began modernizing its investigative divisions, the most significant step being the creation in 2003 of a cold case unit, dedicated to re-examining long-dormant cases now that forensic technology could open new avenues. The unit consisted of 3 veteran detectives and 1 forensic technician trained in the state's new DNA profiling programs. At the unit's very first internal meeting, cold cases were prioritized, and Amelia Reed appeared in the group labeled Possible DNA Testing if Evidence Remains Viable. This marked a major shift, because for decades, Amelia's file had been considered lacking any biological evidence suitable for testing. However, between 1998 and 2000, North Carolina's forensic labs had acquired short tandem repeat STR technology capable of analyzing cellular traces at extremely low levels, enough to revisit evidence once deemed useless. As the cold case unit reviewed missing child cases from the 1950s through the 1970s, they recognized something special about Amelia's file. Her necklace, although returned to the family, had been preserved for years under relatively good protocols. That meant if the necklace still existed intact, DNA might be recoverable from the fabric cord or wooden pendant. Because the evidence was no longer in police custody, it had been legally released to Paul Reed in 1975. The unit first had to confirm whether the item still existed, and if so, whether it had been damaged through handling or storage. Before contacting the family, the unit spent over a week rereading all 4 volumes. They quickly noticed the same irregularities Susan Harrow had flagged in 1995, missing pages, especially in the Lester Cole section, underexplored data about the middle-aged woman in Spartanburg, and only cursory listings of unlicensed adoption facilities. Yet what most caught their attention was Sergeant Tucker's forward-looking note about potential future biological value, written in red ink in the late 1970s. If DNA technology advances, the necklace may contain epithelial cells or sweat traces. It was one of the rare instances of an investigator correctly anticipating future forensic capabilities. After confirming the case met criteria for review, the unit's first concrete step was to inventory any remaining physical evidence in Greensboro PD storage. They opened Box 4, Row E in the cold vault, crime scene photos, a candy wrapper fragment, and 3 plaster casts of lawn impressions. None held viable biological material. The unit verified that the necklace had been properly released to Paul as personal property, though the file retained detailed descriptions and original photographs. An internal meeting then addressed the question, does evidence now in private hands meet legal standards for retrieval and DNA testing? It was not straightforward. Items returned to families can only be reclaimed with the owner's voluntary consent or a court order. The unit decided to start simply by confirming the necklace still existed. They located Paul Reed, now nearly 40, and living in Winston-Salem. While preparing contact, the forensic technician analyzed the necklace's DNA potential based on its physical description. Soft fabric cord likely retained skin cells, especially where it touched the neck. Wooden beads absorbed sweat and natural skin oils, potentially preserving trace DNA even after decades. And regular wear would have deposited cells in microscopic crevices. Risks were significant. The item had been handled by many people since the 1970s, possibly degrading or contaminating any original DNA, but the chance was not zero. Over the next few days, the unit compared modern DNA capabilities with the condition of old evidence. Forensic journals from 2001, 2003 showed STR analysis could succeed with just a few dozen cells. That offered hope that an item kept by family for years might still yield results. In parallel, the unit reviewed Susan Harrow's 1995 findings. Her points about missing pages, the middle-aged woman, possible illegal adoption networks, and undocumented temporary placements in the 1950s were all flagged again in the new report. The unit concluded, the original investigative avenues have low current legal value. However, combining today's DNA technology with re-examination of details overlooked in 1957, could open new directions. After nearly a month of review and planning, the Cold Case Unit officially placed the Amelia Reed case in the DNA priority group, with the report stating, "Case possesses indirect evidence, if recoverable, suitable for biological testing." For the first time in over 40 years, Amelia Reed's name appeared in an internal document next to the words, "Reopening possible, yes." In 2013, in the city of Ocala, Florida, a 61-year-old woman named Linda Mayfield entered what she called a late-life identity crisis. Her personal life had been quiet and stable. She had retired after many years as a medical assistant, had 2 grown daughters, and was living in a small house on the edge of the Pine Oaks neighborhood, where most residents had known one another through many holiday seasons. Yet in Linda's life records, there had always been an unfillable gap. She had no official birth certificate issued in Florida or any other state. According to the paperwork she submitted to the hospital when she applied for a job more than 30 years earlier, she only had a temporary certificate of live birth, signed in 1960 by a pastor of a small church in Putnam County, more than an hour's drive from Ocala. That certificate listed no parents and no specific place of birth, just one short line, "Child placed in care of the church congregation." As a child, Linda had asked many times about her past, but the woman who raised her, whom Linda knew only as Aunt Jeannie, would say only that she had been adopted off the books, and that everyone involved had long since passed away. Jeannie died in 1985, taking with her every answer about Linda's early childhood. There was no adoption record, no baby health records, no school paperwork before 3rd grade, when Linda was first entered into Florida's formal education system. After 1985, with every document chain broken, Linda's legal identity became a series of makeshift fixes, changing her last name for tax purposes, reapplying for a social security number, using affidavits from 2 local witnesses, and passing multiple rounds of manual verification. Having spent most of her life with a shadowy identity, Linda had grown used to not knowing where she belonged, but in her early 60s, that emptiness began to feel unbearable. The turning point came when Linda's younger daughter, Melissa, gave her a 23andMe DNA test kit for Christmas 2012. Melissa said it was just a fun gift to see ancestry percentages, but in reality, she hoped it might give her mother a chance to learn something about her past. Linda was hesitant at first. She had spent her whole life avoiding the question of her true origins, not because she feared the truth, but because she feared there would be nothing to find. Yet one quiet January evening in 2013, in her kitchen bathed in soft yellow light, Linda sat alone reading the instructions, staring at the little vial on the table, and finally uncapped it and provided the sample. She mailed the prepaid envelope and assumed the results would be nothing more than vague ancestry percentages. While she waited, however, Linda began pulling out every childhood document she still had. She spread the brittle papers across the dining table, the temporary birth certificate, a few sparse pediatric visit notes from a local clinic in 1964, a black and white photo of herself as a very small child, with short cropped hair and wide eyes, and a few handwritten lines on the back. Jeannie's girl, 1961. What troubled her most was a faint line in faded blue ink near the corner of the photo. North, the last word blurred by decades of water damage. Linda stared at it, wondering if the missing word could be North Carolina, though she had never believed that guess. Still, the lack of records always left her feeling that her life had begun incompletely. During the weeks of waiting for the DNA results, Linda read online about the testing process and about stories of people reuniting with families after decades apart. Those stories left her both excited and anxious. What if her DNA didn't match anyone? What if she found a family that had forgotten her, or worse, didn't want to remember? She kept those fears to herself and said nothing to her daughters. When her 23andMe account finally activated in March 2013, Linda opened her laptop in the living room and slowly logged in. At first, there were only the expected ancestry charts, but then a new section appeared, DNA relatives. It listed people who shared genetic segments with her. Linda had expected almost nothing, yet the very first entry stopped her cold. Match predicted close family, 27% shared DNA. And the name Paul Reed in North Carolina. Her chest tightened with a feeling that was half recognition, half shock. She stared at the name, wondering if Paul Reed could be someone she had once heard mentioned in Jeannie's scattered stories. She had no idea she had just touched the first piece that might upend her entire life. In that moment, all she knew was that for the first time in 61 years, a computer screen had given her proof that she had family somewhere, and that someone out there shared enough DNA with her for the algorithm to suggest they could be full siblings or very close cousins. Linda rested her hands on the keyboard, but did not message Paul. Not yet. She needed time to breathe, to absorb that her life was about to turn a completely new page, from a woman who didn't know where she came from to a DNA subject with a clear blood connection to a man living more than 500 miles away in a state she had never visited. She did not yet know that the name Paul Reed was the thread that would tie her to a missing person case that had lain dormant for over half a century. It took 23andMe nearly 3 weeks to process the data and compare genetic code, but only milliseconds for the algorithm to recognize that Linda Mayfield's DNA sequence had an unusually high degree of similarity with another user, Paul Reed, who had uploaded his DNA in 2011 to learn more about hereditary disease in his family. When Linda viewed her results, it was just a normal user interface, but behind that simple display lay a deep analytical process. The system scanned STR regions, compared repeating allele counts, identified segments indicating close family relationships, and labeled it predicted close family match. In Linda and Paul's case, 27% shared DNA was extremely rare, typically seen only in parent-child half-match, half-sibling, or full-sibling relationships. The system automatically flagged this as a special match and placed it at the top of both users' lists. For years, Paul's relative list had been almost empty, except for distant cousins. When Linda appeared, the system sent him an automatic email, "You have a close DNA match, possible immediate family." Paul saw the notification but didn't click it right away. He was used to irrelevant DNA alerts. This time, however, when he opened the relatives page, the name Linda Mayfield, Ocala, Florida, 27% shared DNA, made him nearly jump from his chair. He didn't know any Linda in his family. The Reed family tree had no one by that name. But the DNA percentage could not lie. This 61-year-old woman in Florida had a real blood connection to him. At around the same time, 23andMe's algorithm also performed a verification step related to profiles that might connect to public state missing person reports. Since 2010, several commercial testing companies had voluntary agreements to share unusual DNA matches with state cold case units when users opted in to law enforcement cooperation. Paul had opted in when he created his account in 2011. Therefore, when the Paul-Linda match was recorded, the system generated an internal alert, not a public one, but a silent notification to registered agencies, in this case, the Greensboro Cold Case Unit. The message contained only one line. A close DNA relative of Paul Reed has been detected through commercial DNA testing. Greensboro PD did not automatically receive Linda's identity because federal law prohibited releasing personal information without user consent. But the alert was enough for the unit to pull the Amelia Reed file again in April 2013. When Detective Ryan Calloway, who handled long-dormant missing person cases, received the alert, he immediately opened File 57AR. The paper folder was faded after decades, but still contained all foundational documents, plus Tucker's old note about possible DNA from the necklace. Calloway checked the living relatives section and saw Paul Reed clearly listed as remaining brother. What caught his attention was not just that Paul had a new match, but the strength of the match, 27% with a 61-year-old woman in Florida. He did quick mental math. If Amelia was born in 1952, and vanished in 1957, she would be 61 in 2013, exactly Linda's age. It was not proof, but the coincidence was too large to ignore. Calloway requested access to anonymized DNA data from the alert system, then contacted 23andMe's legal support team to ask for indirect contact, meaning the platform would ask the user if she consented to share data with investigators. While waiting, Calloway checked every public record he could find on Linda residence, birth year, public filings. In Florida civil records, he discovered Linda had no standard birth certificate. The only document was a 1960 temporary certificate issued by a pastor in Putnam County, common in cases where children were handed over to religious communities. That was a strong sign, because Amelia's file from 1958-1959 noted that some children during that era were temporarily placed through churches. Calloway continued cross-referencing. Linda had no preschool records and only entered the school system in 1964, the same period when many informally adopted children from the 1950s were re-registered in Florida. Meanwhile, Amelia disappeared in 1957. If she had been taken out of state for a few years, Linda's fragmented paper trail fit perfectly. Calloway wrote in his internal report, disrupted identity records, plus exact age match, plus strong DNA match, subject requires deep verification. When the Greensboro Cold Case Unit received confirmation from 23andMe that Linda agreed to share information for verification purposes, her DNA data table was unlocked for the unit, without health data or extended information. Calloway directly compared Linda's STR markers with the recently reanalyzed DNA recovered from Amelia's necklace. The necklace sample was incomplete, but the remaining usable markers were sufficient for an initial check. When he ran the comparison, 2 of the 4 necklace markers matched Linda's perfectly. It was not conclusive, but it was significant. He spent another hour comparing with Paul's sample and discovered Linda shared 27% with Paul, while the necklace matched markers Paul did not have, markers that could only have come from Amelia. Calloway sat silently for a moment, looking at the 3 data tables, Paul, the necklace, Linda, and for the first time, felt that 3 lives separated for half a century were beginning to converge. The next step was no longer theoretical. For the first time in 56 years, the system had signaled that a woman living in Florida might be the little girl who vanished from Greensboro on the afternoon of May 14, 1957. Immediately after the DNA comparison showed a notable match between Linda Mayfield and the remaining biological markers from Amelia's necklace, Greensboro PD decided to fully reactivate File 57AR, officially moving the case out of cold status for the first time since 1963. Detective Ryan Calloway, who had followed the DNA lead from the beginning, was given complete authority over the original 1957 files and full access to every piece of evidence, photograph, and report. Calloway received 4 thick binders, nearly 800 pages of faded paper from archives, and spent days simply reading, resequencing chronologically, and sorting information into 3 tiers: legally valuable data, questionable data, and data previously ignored. Due to technological limitations at the time, his first task was to re-verify the integrity of all remaining physical evidence. The candy wrapper was re-examined under forensic lighting for traces of fiber, skin, or biological oil. Results showed it was too degraded for direct DNA, but was still photographed and microscopically documented. The plaster casts of footprints were checked to see if they could be digitized into 3D images for footwear analysis, but the samples were too poor. Crime scene photos, especially those of the roadside edge and flattened grass, were scanned at high resolution for AI-enhanced imaging to reveal tiny details the naked eye had missed. Yet among all the original evidence, the most important remained the photographs of the necklace and its detailed physical description, because that item had created the DNA bridge between past and present. To assess the necklace DNA sample's value, Calloway asked the forensics lab for a standardized report: degree of degradation, ability to reconstruct markers, and certainty level when compared to Linda's and Paul's samples. The conclusion, although the quantity was low, the remaining markers were from stable genetic regions and held legal weight when combined with close relative reference data, a critical factor for continuing the investigation. While reviewing the paper files, what particularly struck Calloway were missing pages from the Lester Cole interview report and inconsistencies between witness statements and the final summary. He flagged numerous handwritten notes by Sergeant Tucker, including possible approach from roadside in 10 seconds and likely prior surveillance of child, showing Tucker had strongly leaned toward a premeditated perpetrator. Calloway compiled all those notes into a new master table to determine which historical elements should guide the current investigation. Next, Calloway opened the Amelia Identifying Features, Section 8 photos from 1956-1957. A height of 104 centimeters, naturally curly blonde hair, blue eyes, and a small crescent-shaped scar behind the right ear. He knew that to visually confirm Linda Mayfield, he would need an age-progressed image of Amelia at 61. Calloway contacted the FBI's Technical Support Unit to use their AI aging software, which predicts appearance over time, based on childhood photos, facial bone structure, DNA, and family genetic data. He supplied 3 photos of Amelia at age 5, photos of Helen and Thomas Reed, and Paul's basic DNA profile, so the system could identify Reed family traits. The aging process took nearly 48 hours. The AI analyzed each facial region, predicted bone structure changes, skin sagging, pigment shifts, and typical hair patterns for white women of that generation. When complete, it produced 6 versions of a 61-year-old face under different lighting and hairstyles. Calloway sat at the computer and studied each one. 2 versions stood out with striking similarity: slightly deep-set blue eyes, high cheekbones, and the curve of the lower lip. Those images immediately reminded him of Linda Mayfield's current driver license and civil record photos he had already seen. Still, Calloway was not allowed to rely on gut feeling. He had to continue the verification process. He requested the facial recognition unit run a comparison between the AI-aged images of Amelia at 61 and real photos of Linda at the same age. The result came back at 78% similarity, high enough to proceed, though not conclusive. Meanwhile, Calloway re-examined the entire 1957 scene report. Even without a body, there were many environmental and location descriptions. He reanalyzed maps of possible escape routes that could remove a child from the area in 90 seconds. Modern digital mapping allowed simulation of travel times and paths from Maple Hollow Road, through woods, paved roads or back roads to the highway. He confirmed that the southern route, leading to the main highway toward South Carolina, remained the most feasible and matched the 1957 Spartanburg gas station witness statement. All of this data Calloway compiled into a 23-page report marked basis for case reactivation, strong DNA match, supportive physical evidence, high facial recognition similarity. Finally, he placed the entire file on his desk, looked at the black and white photo of Amelia, 5 years old, curly hair, bright smile, and realized that after many decades, this was the first time the case had a real link between the missing child and a living person. And so, the Amelia Reed file was officially reopened, for the first time in 56 years, with full authority, modern technology, and manpower to establish the truth. Calloway understood that to verify Linda Mayfield's identity went far beyond DNA. He had to trace her entire life history, a history that had been completely erased for the first 2 decades. The first step was to track down the only origin point Linda had on record, a temporary birth certificate signed by a pastor in 1960 in Putnam County. Although the document only stated placed in care of the congregation, the signing name was Reverend Samuel Hargrove. That name was enough for Calloway to start searching churches in the Putnam County area. After a week of digging through old church directories and microfilmed records, he determined that Reverend Hargrove had run a small church called Hargrove Mission Church, operating from 1952 to 1974 on the outskirts of Palatka. The building no longer existed, but most of the congregation's records had been transferred to the Florida Historical Society archives. Calloway went there in person and requested access to the old ledger books, the congregation's activity journals from that era. When he opened the volume for the early 1960s, he found an entry, "Received a female child approximately 3 years old from an unknown woman, no paperwork. Temporarily placed in care of Jeannie M." This was Jeannie, the woman who had raised Linda from early childhood. The entry gave no surname for the child, only the code F60103. However, the detail delivered by unknown woman caught Calloway's attention because it matched the 1957 data. The Spartanburg gas station attendant had described a middle-aged woman with a little blonde girl. Digging deeper, Calloway requested baptismal records, care logs, and lists of all children who had passed through Hargrove Mission Church during that period. Between 1955 and 1962, the ledger recorded a total of 14 cases of young children handed over to temporary foster families without going through the legal system. Some were noted as no state verification, no relatives presented, or no birth certificate. Linda fell into this category. But what caught Calloway's eye most were 3 cases recorded as originating from North Carolina, a rare detail since nearly all the children in the ledger came from nearby areas in Florida. When cross-referencing with the timeline of Amelia's disappearance in 1957, Calloway found one case that matched the timing. Female child, estimated 4 years old, delivered by woman, no paperwork, July 1957. No name, no photo. Only the code NC. He marked that entry in red pen. Next, Calloway moved to the second step, determining whether Lester Cole, the high-level suspect in the 1957 file, had any connection to Hargrove Mission Church or the child transfer network of that era. Reviewing Lester's travel records and financial history again, he uncovered a faint lead. Lester had relatives living in Jacksonville, Florida, in the late 1950s, and had visited Florida at least twice, according to a 1958 bank receipt. Jacksonville was less than 60 miles from Palatka. Calloway dug further by contacting the Labor Records Archive and discovered that Lester had worked a 3-week short-term contract at a shipyard in Green Cove Springs in 1958, a location just a 30-minute drive from Hargrove Mission Church. This was the first geographic link between Lester and the church in the period immediately following Amelia's disappearance. Additionally, in an unresolved 1959 tax file, Lester recorded a small donation payment to an unnamed religious organization. Although there was no direct evidence, this became an item to re-examine. Did Lester know Reverend Hargrove, or someone at the church, or had he ever been involved in transporting children? Calloway noted in his report, connection probability, moderate. Requires further investigation. The third step in Calloway's plan was to compile a complete list of all 14 children transferred through Hargrove Mission Church from 1955 to 1962. He photographed every ledger entry, then created a classification table: approximate age, date received, person who delivered, person who received, and any related locations. When he filtered the cases by criteria, delivered by a woman, no paperwork, from North Carolina, or unknown origin, he narrowed it down to 4 records: 1 female child, 4 years old, July 1957, code NC, 2, female child, 3 years old, January 1956, delivered by stranger, 3 female child, 5 years old, March 1958, origin unknown, 4 male child, 4 years old, November 1955, no birth certificate. Linda was most likely case 1 or case 3, but case 1, July 1957, aligned perfectly with the period right after Amelia's disappearance in May 1957. Looking closer at the ledger, Calloway noticed that entry had an additional, barely legible line written in faded ink, brought by woman traveling alone, no name, child very quiet. He circled it in red, child very quiet, a detail that matched exactly the Spartanburg gas station attendant's 1957 statement. Into compiling all the data, Calloway saw a coherent chain forming. Little girl disappears in Greensboro. Witness sees her with a strange woman in South Carolina. Child delivered to Hargrove Mission Church in Florida. Roughly 2 months later, handed off to Jeannie. Grows up as Linda Mayfield. It was still just a hypothesis, but for the first time it had clear structure. He created a summary chart and highlighted 3 directions for deeper investigation. 1. Lester Cole's role, whether he transported the child or merely removed her from Greensboro. The identity of the woman who delivered the child to Hargrove Mission Church. 3. The likelihood that Linda is the child. Coded NC, July 1957. At the end of a long workday, Calloway closed the ledger with a final note on the page. Clues from 1957, 1958, 1960, and 2013 are converging. Must continue tracing the entire illegal child transfer route through Hargrove Mission Church. Calloway knew that approaching Linda Mayfield had to be handled with extreme care. He couldn't just show up unannounced at her home in Ocala and tell her she might be a missing person from 1957. He first contacted her with an official call from Greensboro PD, introducing himself as an investigator working on a historical case that required verification of personal information. He did not mention Amelia Reed's name yet. Linda agreed to meet, somewhat wary but not opposed. The meeting was arranged at a small community office in Ocala to avoid drawing attention. When Linda walked in, Calloway immediately noticed her face nearly matched the AI-aged progression, cheekbone structure, slightly deep-set eyes, the curve of her lower lip. But he remained completely professional and revealed nothing. He began by explaining the reason for contact. We have an old case that's been reopened, and we need to verify some information about individuals with incomplete early life records. Linda nodded, acknowledging that she had no original documents from before 1960. Calloway asked permission to collect basic personal data, place of birth, childhood residences, schools, information about her caregiver. Linda provided what little she had, a very thin list. She said she had lived with Jeannie from around age 3 or 4, but couldn't remember exactly when it started. Before that, she didn't know where she had been. When Calloway asked about Hargrove Mission Church, Linda said she remembered it as a small wooden building where she used to go with Jeannie to services when she was little. That matched the church records. When asked who had brought her to Jeannie, Linda simply shook her head. Jeannie said a woman handed me over to her. I never knew who that woman was. Calloway then asked to see Linda's documents. She had brought a folder containing the temporary birth certificate, childhood photos, a 1964 medical record, and a torn piece of paper with the smudged writing, North. Calloway had already reviewed all of these indirectly through Florida records, but seeing them in person confirmed there was no forgery. He asked if Linda had any memories of where she lived before Florida. Linda paused, then quietly said she had vague memories of a bright-colored house, a yard with lots of grass, and a red ball. Calloway kept his expression neutral, but inside he immediately connected it to the red ball found at the 1957 scene. He asked if she remembered any faces from those distant memories. Linda said there was a young woman's face with light-colored hair, but it was too blurry to describe. These memories weren't strong enough to serve as evidence, but they were enough to show Linda had some mental images of her very early childhood, something rare in children illegally placed when they were that young. Calloway moved into a semi-structured interview phase, asking about her earliest schooling. Linda said she only started school in Ocala in 1964, when she was about 12, with the note "no prior records," admitted late. The school records confirmed this. She had no vaccination records or pediatric files from ages 0, 6. When asked about medical history, Linda said her first medical record was at a Putnam County clinic in 1964, where she was listed as newly arrived child, missing information. Once again, the data matched perfectly the church's description of children received outside official channels. Calloway asked the final question of the first meeting. Over the course of your life, Have you ever felt you weren't actually born in Florida? Linda gave a small, sad smile. I always knew I didn't belong there. I don't know why, but I thought I came from up north. When asked why she thought that, Linda showed the old black and white photo with the smudged north writing. She said Jeannie had only ever said one thing when Linda asked about her origins: you came from the north. Calloway realized this was the first piece of data from Linda's life that directly matched the North Carolina investigation. Before ending the interview, Calloway asked Linda to sign a legal consent form to share DNA data, explaining it would only be used to verify her origins. Linda agreed without hesitation. She said, "If I really belong somewhere else, I want to know." As Linda left the room, Calloway quickly wrote in his notebook, "Data matches missing person file almost completely. Memories consistent with scene. No contradictory records. Continue verification." In his mind, the pieces were starting to connect in a striking way, but he knew the entire process had to remain strictly within legal boundaries before revealing any conclusion to Linda or the Reed family. Immediately after the first meeting with Linda Mayfield in Ocala, Calloway proceeded to the most critical step of the entire investigation: a full forensic DNA test. Not commercial data, not a preliminary match, but a biological comparison under North Carolina criminal standards. He immediately submitted an official request to Greensboro PD and the State Crime Lab for permission to conduct testing under Statute 15-266.7, which allows re-examination of evidence in cold cases when new genetic material becomes available. Within 48 hours, the order was approved. Calloway called Linda, explained that an official DNA sample was needed to verify her origins, and she agreed. An authorized investigator from the Marion County Sheriff's Office went to her home to collect the sealed sample following strict protocol: 2 buccal swabs, placed in a preservation tube, sealed as evidence, signed and shipped directly to the Florida lab, then transferred via secure interstate evidence channel to North Carolina. At the same time, Calloway had to recover the most important piece of evidence, Amelia's necklace, currently in Paul Reed's possession. He drove to Winston-Salem, met Paul, explained that the necklace needed to be temporarily seized for testing, and Paul, his hands shaking as he handed over the item tied to his family's memories, fully cooperated. The necklace was placed in a sterile box, triple sealed to biological evidence standard, labeled Case 57 ARVC 2013, and delivered to the North Carolina State Crime Lab. When the necklace arrived at the lab, forensic technicians opened the seal in a high-level clean room. The goal was to recover any remaining skin cells, body oils, or microscopic sweat trapped in the fabric cord or wooden surface. This was difficult because the evidence was over half a century old. They used the microparticle lift method with special forensic tape to capture the maximum amount of residual cells. A tiny quantity of cells was recovered, enough to run STR-PCR analysis, the standard criminal DNA technique. However, because the evidence was so old, only 9 of the 16 standard markers produced strong enough results to read. That might have seemed like a failure, but for direct familial comparisons such as parent-child or sibling, only 8 markers are required. Linda's DNA underwent the same STR process, producing a clear, complete marker profile perfectly suited for kinship analysis. Over the next 3 days, the forensic team ran multiple comparisons: Linda versus the necklace markers, Linda versus Paul's sample, and the remaining markers against reconstructed Reed family genetic data. Results came in piece by piece. 8 of the 9 necklace markers matched Linda's in a pattern consistent with parent-child or full siblings, but when allele lengths were examined, the sibling model, not parent-child, was the better fit. This was the first confirmation the necklace had been in contact with Linda during childhood. Next, the Linda-Paul comparison showed 27% shared DNA in commercial databases and 25.8% under forensic standards, exactly within the full sibling range, same father or same mother. Finally, a statistical likelihood ratio was calculated. The probability ratio between the hypothesis Linda is unrelated and Linda is Paul's full sibling came out greater than 1.2 billion to 1, an essentially conclusive figure in kinship testing. The 23-page forensic report was completed, stamped by the North Carolina State Crime Lab, and signed by 3 independent experts. The final conclusion line, 7 words Calloway read over and over, was probability of biological sibling relationship, 99.9998%. The result was strong enough to be entered into the legal system as definitive identification evidence in a missing person case. Greensboro PD opened file 57-hour DNA resolve, entered the test results into NamUs and FBI VICAP, and updated the missing person, Amelia Reed record, to located, biological identity confirmed. For the first time in 56 years, a law enforcement agency officially recorded that Amelia Reed was no longer an unidentified missing person, but a living woman, under the name Linda Mayfield. Although the full story of those 56 years could not yet be told, the DNA identification had set an irreversible milestone. Amelia had been found. After the DNA results officially confirmed that Linda Mayfield was Amelia Reed, Calloway moved into the most necessary yet sensitive phase of the investigation, recovering the victim's childhood memories, not to prove identity, which was already established, but to map the travel route, intermediaries, and the mechanism by which Amelia was removed from Greensboro between the afternoon of May 14, 1957, and her appearance at Hargrove Mission Church in July of the same year. Recovering memories after more than half a century is difficult, but not impossible. Linda carried scattered fragments, small, faint, yet distinct enough to match against historical data. The first session was held in a small conference room at the Marion County Sheriff's Office, with Linda sitting across from Calloway and a trauma memory specialist. They asked Linda to describe any images, sounds, smells, or colors she could recall from her earliest years, even if only for a few seconds. Linda closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and said her earliest memory was a grassy yard with late afternoon sunlight slanting across it, and she was playing with a red ball. Calloway wrote it down immediately. The red ball recovered from the Reed lawn in 1957 was a key item in the scene report. Linda continued, after that she remembered a loud car sound, like a door slamming hard, and adult footsteps moving quickly on dirt, then the sensation of being lifted off the ground. This matched the theory that the perpetrator approached from the street in a very short window of time. When asked if she remembered anything about a man or a woman, Linda's response was vague. She recalled a smell like cigarettes and engine oil and a large hand grabbing her wrist, but the face was completely blank. Calloway noted that engine oil smell had appeared in records connected to Lester Cole, who had a history of mechanical work and smoked Camel cigarettes. Linda stressed, however, that the memory was very faint and could be a product of childhood trauma. When the specialist guided Linda forward in time, she described a long drive with dark patches on both sides and headlights shining at an angle through the car window. This matched the 1957 Greensboro-Spartanburg route, which passed through many wooded, poorly lit highway sections. Linda added that she remembered a gas station with harsh white lights and a strong gasoline smell. Calloway instantly recognized the match with the 1957 Spartanburg attendant's statement, describing a blonde little girl standing next to a middle-aged woman. Linda did not remember who the woman was, but she recalled a dark floral dress and a Southern woman's voice. This was the first detail Linda recalled that the 1957 file had not specifically described, and it was significant because it strengthened the possibility that the woman was not a minor figure, but the person who directly took Amelia out of North Carolina. The specialist asked Linda to continue past the gas station. She said she seemed to be placed in the back seat of a different car, not the first one, and the woman sat next to her, holding her close. This detail strongly caught Calloway's attention because it suggested at least 2 people were involved, one who took Amelia to South Carolina and a female intermediary who then continued the journey. When asked about what came next, Linda described strong wind, a long road, and many hours of darkness, she remembered falling asleep on the woman's lap. When she woke up, she saw lower trees, not like forest, and the weather was hot and humid, an accurate description of North Florida in summer. Calloway pulled up a 1957 road map for comparison. If the car left Spartanburg in the evening, followed the old highway down through Savannah and into Florida, the 8-10-hour drive perfectly matched Linda's fell asleep, woke up, felt hot wind sequence. Linda's next memory was of a wooden building shaped like a small church, with lots of dark brown pews. This matched Hargrove Mission Church almost exactly. Linda said the woman took her inside, spoke briefly with an older man, very possibly Reverend Hargrove, and then left. Linda didn't remember the pastor's face, but remembered his voice was low and gentle, and that he gave her a glass of water. When Calloway asked how she felt at that moment, Linda answered, "I think I had been left behind." That detail was valuable because the church ledger noted, "Child very quiet, no contact from woman after drop-off." The investigator continued guiding her memory into the following years. Linda remembered that after a short time at the church, a woman named Jeannie came to get her and took her to a small house near the woods. She remembered Jeannie treated her well, but never answered questions about where she came from. All these details, grassy yard with red ball sensation of being lifted brightly lit gas station, second car long night drive, turning hot and humid wooden church, formed a complete travel chain that Calloway could plot on a map. The only pieces still missing were the role of the initial man and the identity of the female intermediary. Based on Linda's memories, Calloway concluded there was likely a small, informal but structured network. A man removes the child from Greensboro, a female intermediary transports her across state lines, and a religious facility receives the child for placement with a foster family. After the nearly 3-hour session, Calloway summarized in his report, victims' memories fully consistent with 1957 travel route data and Hargrove records 1957-1960. Probability of intermediary high, must continue tracing the woman seen in Spartanburg and Lester Cole's connections. Calloway knew that to fully establish the entire chain of events that led to Amelia being removed from Greensboro in 1957, he had to clarify the role of Lester Cole, who had once been a prime suspect but was never charged. Now, with DNA confirming that Amelia was still alive, the next question was who took the little girl from her home. And among the names that appeared repeatedly throughout the original case file, Lester Cole emerged as the intersection of time, geography, and behavior. Calloway began by reviewing all of Cole's known movements from 1957 to 1963, the period immediately following the disappearance and before the file was closed. Archival records showed that Cole had lived in Greensboro since 1951. Working as a machinery repairman at a shop near Maple Hollow Road. He had a flexible work schedule and often took extra weekend repair jobs or delivery runs. Tax records revealed that in 1957, his income was lower than in any previous year. Yet there was one notable expense, a sudden spike in fuel costs during May and June, that did not match his usual commuting distance. Calloway flagged this entry because it suggested Cole may have been traveling interstate. Bank records from the small local bank, where Cole had an account, showed that in July 1957, he withdrew an unusually large sum, and then shortly afterward, deposited a smaller amount in Jacksonville, Florida, a city only about 60 miles from Palatka, where the Hargrove Church operated. Next, Calloway located Cole's temporary residency records in Green Cove Springs in 1958, exactly as he had previously discovered. This time, however, he cross-referenced that timeline with the Hargrove Church ledger and realized Cole was in Florida during the exact period when entries appeared for children delivered by strange woman in Pastor Hargrove's records. From this, a critical hypothesis emerged. Cole may have taken Amelia out of Greensboro, then met the female intermediary in South Carolina to hand her over, after which the woman took the child down to Florida and delivered her to the Hargrove Church. To strengthen this hypothesis, Calloway needed to re-examine Cole's original 1957 statements, especially the pages missing from the main file. He located secondary copies of the original report, preserved on microfilm at the Guilford County Courthouse. There he found 2 pages of notes that did not appear in the police department's archived file, one stating Cole refused to allow inspection of the trunk, and another noting Cole changed a tire before police arrived. These details were significant because the 1957 crime scene had yielded a tire tread impression consistent with a Ford Custom Line, the exact make and model Cole owned. Another detail made Calloway pause. Cole claimed that afternoon he had been repairing equipment for a customer south of Greensboro and never went to Maple Hollow Road that day, yet no one in the file corroborated this alibi. Moreover, a 1957 witness interview described a man wearing a dark-colored cap near the area where Amelia vanished. Cole was known to regularly wear just such a cap. Calloway reviewed old photo folders and confirmed Cole's build matched the witness description. With all these factors, Calloway needed to determine whether Cole had any direct connection to the Hargrove Church. He searched financial records, charitable donations, correspondence, tax documents, and the church's donor lists from the 1950s. In the Hargrove ledger for 1958-1959, there was a small entry, donation, visitor from NC. No name was recorded, but it coincided with the year Cole was in the area. Continuing to match Cole's travel patterns against the Greensboro, Spartanburg, Florida route, Calloway saw that Cole's movements in 1957-1958 aligned perfectly with that corridor from Greensboro down into South Carolina, then into Florida. Although there was no direct evidence to charge him, the cumulative trail suggested Cole likely served as the initial transporter, the person who removed Amelia from Greensboro and then handed her off to the female intermediary. Next, Calloway traced Cole's residences after 1960. Cole left Greensboro in 1961, drifting through various places, Virginia, Georgia, before returning to North Carolina in 1968. He then lived in a rundown house in Garner, working odd jobs until he died of lung disease in 1992. When Calloway verified this, he stopped short. Cole had been dead for over 20 years, meaning direct interrogation was impossible. That complicated reconstructing the truth, but it did not rule out his involvement in the disappearance. Calloway obtained a warrant to search the boxes of Cole's final personal papers held by the court, files abandoned after his death, with no relatives to claim them. The boxes contained only scattered documents, repair receipts, a few work notes, an old folded road map of eastern interstate routes, and a single pencil note, Palatka, Hargrove, July. This was the strongest clue yet from Cole, matching perfectly with the church ledger and the timing of the child-coded NC being delivered. Calloway added this evidence to the investigative file, marking it Lester Cole, high probability role. Initial transport direct involvement, Greensboro, South Carolina stage. Though Cole was long dead and could not be confronted, the combined data from travel records, old statements, tire evidence, Florida timeline, and the Palatka, Hargrove, July note made him a prime suspect who had to be formally documented in the final report. Calloway closed this section with an internal conclusion: prosecution of Cole no longer possible, but his role in the Amelia case is extremely high. Remaining focus must shift to verifying the female intermediary, to complete the full picture of how Amelia was removed from Greensboro in 1957. Calloway broadened his scope to analyze the larger system, the underground network of illegal child placements in the American South during the 1950s and 1960s, which had operated as a shadow channel before federal law tightened adoption procedures. He spent nearly a month reviewing hundreds of pages of historical material, demographic reports, university studies on gray adoptions in the South, federal investigations into religious facilities suspected of undocumented child transfers, and records from social welfare agencies in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. The synthesis painted a clear pattern from the 1940s Through the 1960s, certain small groups within local churches, particularly independent or self-governing congregations, participated in accepting children with no paperwork. Some were abandoned, others arrived from unknown sources, and they were then quickly placed with families who wanted to bypass formal legal processes. Most cases showed no obvious criminal intent, but the lack of transparency and record-keeping made the system ripe for use in kidnappings or illegal child trafficking. When Calloway compared this network model to Amelia's case, he found striking parallels. Children vanished suddenly from their communities with no signs of foul play or accident. The recurring presence of a middle-aged woman, a hallmark of these intermediary handoffs, since networks often used women to transport children to avoid suspicion. 3. The travel route followed the North Carolina-South Carolina-Florida axis, which the FBI had once identified as a known southern transfer corridor in the 1950s. 4 children were delivered to a small church before reaching adoptive families, perfectly matching the Hargrove Mission Church pattern. 5 original documentation disappeared entirely, so the child's legal identity only began years later, exactly as happened with Linda. These parallels were not speculative. They formed a logical framework into which every piece of Amelia's case fit. With that foundation, Calloway returned to a figure previously under-examined, the middle-aged woman seen at the Spartanburg gas station in 1957. Reviewing old statements alongside the Hargrove Church ledger, which recorded 3 entries marked child delivered by woman, he noted that the only entry with a description, middle-aged woman, light-colored hair, southern accent, appeared in July 1957, aligning with when Amelia would have reached Florida. Cross-referencing church administrative records, Calloway found one name recurring across multiple entries: Eleanor Hargrove, the younger sister of Reverend Samuel Hargrove. Eleanor was not a pastor but had been listed as the person assisting with women's activities in the congregation from 1955 to 1963. Although no record explicitly stated she received children, her name appeared in ledger pages managing assets, in notes about new arrivals, and on lists of members handling charity work in Palatka and surrounding areas. Most significantly, Eleanor had lived in Spartanburg, South Carolina, from 1954 to 1956, before moving to Florida to live with her brother. That location matched the gas station sighting, opening a crucial possibility. Eleanor may have used Spartanburg as a transfer point where she met the initial transporter, possibly Cole, to take custody of Amelia. Calloway expanded his search for Eleanor, residency records, documents after the church closed, and her death certificate. He confirmed she died in 1998, childless, leaving few personal papers. However, among materials descendants of Reverend Hargrove donated to the Florida Historical Society was a handwritten note by Eleanor. July 57, child from NC, very quiet, delivered safely. That line stopped Calloway cold. It was the strongest evidence yet of Eleanor's role as the female intermediary in Amelia's case. Child from NC matched the ledger code NC, July 1957. Very quiet matched the 1957 gas station attendant's description. And delivered, a term commonly used in illegal adoption networks of the era, indicated Eleanor likely transported Amelia from South Carolina to the Hargrove Church. When assessing Eleanor's place in the illegal child placement network, Calloway compared it to historical reports on women intermediaries, middle-aged women who served as the link between the initial abductor and the receiving facility. The classic pattern: a man removes the child from the original environment, hands the child to a woman, the woman delivers the child to a religious facility or waiting family. Eleanor fit this model perfectly. Calloway concluded his analysis with a 12-point comparison table between Amelia's case and known illegal child placement networks of the period. In every respect, Eleanor occupied the central role. She was the link connecting Cole to the Hargrove Church, the person who physically moved Amelia across state lines, and the one who determined the child's final destination. And although she had been dead for decades, the historical evidence was strong enough to establish that Amelia's abduction was not a random act, but part of a decades-long unregulated child placement system that operated in the shadows of the American South. Calloway spent weeks combining DNA results, Linda's memories, historical data, 1957 witness statements, and the entire original file to reconstruct the complete timeline and probable sequence of the kidnapping. He began at the scene on Maple Hollow Road, where Amelia Reed was playing with her red ball in the front yard at 4:03 p.m. on May 14, 1957. Using Helen's description, Betty Carson's statement, the crushed grass pattern, the ball's final position, and the 90-second window when no one was watching, Calloway built a behavioral model of the abductor. A black Ford Custom Line slowed on Maple Hollow Road while Amelia played near the curb. The driver observed during a short loop, then stopped 20-30 meters from the Reed house. Timing it precisely for the moment, Helen stepped inside for 40-60 seconds, and Betty turned to the kitchen for a newspaper. That interval created a perfect opening for a rapid approach. Calloway simulated the approach. The abductor exited the vehicle, walked straight across the grass edge, and came up behind Amelia's left side, the angle least visible from the Reed house windows. Based on the direction of the bent grass, footprint orientation, and Linda's memory of being lifted off the ground, Calloway determined the abductor scooped Amelia up quickly, one arm locked across her torso, the other supporting close to her chest to minimize struggle. There were no signs of prolonged resistance, because Amelia had no time to react or cry out. The abductor then turned quickly back to the car, opened either the front or rear passenger door, depending on configuration, placed Amelia on the back seat, and slammed the door, consistent with Linda's sound memory and a neighbor's report of hearing a strange thud within 1-2 seconds. The engine started, and the car left the scene heading south toward the main Greensboro, High Point Road. Departure time was estimated at 4:05 p.m., and reverse tire marks indicated a hurried U-turn, matching Calloway's simulation. Next, Calloway mapped the route to South Carolina. Leaving Greensboro at 4:05 p.m., the car took the main road to High Point Road and joined the old highway through Charlotte. At average 1957 speeds of 45-50 miles per hour, the vehicle would reach the South Carolina border around 6:40 p.m. Based on the Spartanburg gas station attendant's statement that the woman and little girl appeared around dusk, not too late, Calloway placed the handoff of Amelia from the initial abductor, most likely Lester Cole, to the female intermediary, most likely Eleanor Hargrove, at approximately 7:20 p.m. at the gas station on the outskirts of Spartanburg. DNA evidence and Linda's memories supported this scenario. She recalled bright white lights, the smell of gasoline, and being moved to a different car. This indicated two participants, Lester Cole as the probable first-stage transporter, Eleanor as the receiver, who continued the journey. Calloway envisioned the handoff as follows. Cole pulled into the station at the prearranged spot. Eleanor, wearing a dark floral dress as Linda remembered, stepped out of a second vehicle, a typical 1950s sedan or station wagon. Amelia was either carried out by Cole or walked under guidance. Eleanor took the child into her own car, calming her and keeping her close to avoid attention. The gas station attendant described the little girl as very quiet, which Linda also recalled when she said she was very still, didn't cry. After the exchange, Cole's car departed in the opposite direction, while Eleanor's continued south, merging onto the long highway toward Georgia and Florida. Calloway used 1957 road maps to simulate the three-state journey from Spartanburg. The car followed the old highway through Columbia, into Georgia, around Savannah, then down to Jacksonville, Florida. Non-stop driving time was roughly 8-10 hours, consistent with Linda's memory of a very long night, strong wind outside, and waking up to weather that felt warm, humid, and completely different. By around 4-5 a.m., Eleanor would have reached the Palatka or Green Cove Springs area near the Hargrove Church. The church ledger recorded a child from North Carolina, delivered in July 1957, but Calloway hypothesized that if the abduction occurred in May, Amelia may have been kept by Eleanor for several weeks before formal placement, a pattern of temporary care noted in some other ledger cases. Finally, Calloway reconstructed the delivery in Florida. Eleanor brought Amelia to the Hargrove Mission Church early in the morning, where Reverend Samuel Hargrove received her. The ledger described the child as very quiet and no clear name. There, Hargrove entered the code NC July 1957, confirming the child came from North Carolina. After a short period at the church, Amelia was transferred to Jeannie M., who became Linda's first adoptive caregiver. The complete reconstructed sequence aligned almost perfectly with the DNA, memories, vehicle positions, transfer times, church records, and Lester Cole's movements. From Maple Hollow Road, Spartanburg, Palatka, Hargrove Church, Jeannie's home, every scattered piece from 56 years finally formed a coherent chain sufficient to recreate the full abduction and transportation of Amelia in 1957. Calloway understood that after more than half a century, the reunion of two blood siblings could not happen in a rush. Although DNA had confirmed that Linda was indeed Amelia Reed, the legal process still required one final step: verification of biological kinship through identification comparison and personal records to ensure that the biological conclusion fully matched the life data. He contacted Paul Reed, who had been waiting for a response from Greensboro PD ever since receiving notice of a special DNA match related to Amelia's file. When Calloway delivered the final result, Paul was silent for a very long time on the other end of the line, trying to swallow the information he had never imagined he would hear in his lifetime. "Your sister is alive." After several minutes, Paul could only manage 4 words: "I need to meet her." Before arranging the meeting, Calloway had to assess Linda's psychological state to ensure she could handle the reunion. A Greensboro PD psychologist traveled to Ocala to meet her. He explained that the process of family re-identification after decades of separation often led to 2 extreme reactions, either overwhelming joy or complete collapse. Linda listened carefully, saying nothing for many minutes, then spoke softly, "If I really have a brother, I want to meet him, but I'm scared." The psychologist asked, "What are you afraid of?" Linda replied, "I'm afraid I won't remember anything. I'm afraid I won't be the person they once loved." She didn't cry, but her hands trembled slightly. That was the sign of a fear of second loss, a fear common in victims separated from their families when they were far too young. Calloway proposed that the meeting be held under controlled conditions in a small conference room inside the Marion County Sheriff's Office building, with psychological support present and no media access. Paul Reed took the first flight to Florida in early August 2013. He brought a small box containing a few family photos, a picture of Amelia taken in 1957 that he had kept since their mother's death, and a letter he had written overnight but wasn't sure he would use. When Paul entered the room, Linda was already seated at the opposite end of the table. They looked at each other, neither spoke. Calloway stepped back to give them space. Paul's eyes flickered between disbelief and a lifetime of unrelieved pain. Linda looked at him with confusion, as if trying to search for an image in her memory that she knew she couldn't possess. Paul spoke first, his voice choking, "I'm Paul, your brother." Linda instinctively raised her hand to her mouth. Her eyes widened, then closed, as if to hold back a wave of emotion. I don't remember anything," she blurted out, as if that answer was the one that made her feel most guilty. Paul shook his head and took one step closer. "It's okay, you don't have to remember. I remember you." Linda began to cry, not an explosive sob, but a quiet, unstoppable release that ran deep. Paul moved closer, sat down across from her, and opened the wooden box. He took out the photo of 5-year-old Amelia, blonde hair, round cheeks, blue eyes, and placed it in front of Linda. "This is you," he said. Linda stared at the picture for a long time. She reached out and lightly touched the edge of the photo, her eyes fixed on the little girl's. "I didn't know I was ever like this," she said, her voice breaking. "But something feels familiar." Paul smiled, then pulled out another photo, the 1956 Reed family portrait, with Amelia sitting on their mother's lap. When she saw it, Linda froze. She tilted her head, studying the face of the young woman in the picture. "I don't remember her," Linda said. "But I want to." Calloway and the psychologist stood silently in the background, allowing the moment to settle. Paul continued telling her about the family, about their mother Helen, their father Thomas, the last summer before Amelia disappeared, the necklace their mother had made by hand for the little girl. Linda listened to every word, her eyes never leaving the photos. "The necklace," Linda whispered. "I want to see it." Paul took the necklace out of the box. The string had darkened with age, but the shape remained unchanged. When Linda saw it, she placed a hand on her chest, as if something had just touched the deepest part of her memory. "I don't remember wearing it," she said, "but this feeling is real." That was one of the characteristic psychological responses the expert called emotional memory, memory by emotion rather than by images, common in people separated from their families too early. When Paul placed the necklace on the table, Linda reached out and touched it very gently, as if afraid of damaging it. She whispered, "Thank you for keeping it for me." The meeting lasted more than 2 hours, filled with long silences. The siblings began talking about Linda's life, her 2 daughters, Paul's family. No one tried to make up for all the lost years. They simply tried to reconnect through the real things that existed in the present. At the end of the session, the psychologist assessed Linda's reaction as positive: no signs of panic, no denial of identity, no dissociative episodes. She accepted the information, even if she hadn't fully processed the emotions yet. The report noted, "Victim shows good adaptability. Long-term monitoring recommended due to risk of delayed trauma memory resurgence." As they left the room, Paul paused at the door, turned to Linda and asked, "Can I call you Amelia?" Linda hesitated for a second, then shook her head, gently but firmly. "Call me Linda, but I want to learn more about Amelia, so I can know who I once was." Paul nodded, understanding that the reunion had begun. But the healing process would take time, and the truth still had dark corners neither of them had yet touched. Although DNA had confirmed Linda was Amelia Reed, and the entire 56-year journey had been reconstructed fairly clearly, Calloway still faced a list of questions that could not be definitively answered. Dark gaps that existed not only because of the passage of time, but because the central figures were either deceased or had vanished from the records. The biggest question remained: who was the real perpetrator? DNA and travel data made Lester Cole the most likely suspect, but there was no direct evidence placing him at the scene between 4:03 and 4:05 p.m. on May 14, 1957. The tire tracks matched Cole's vehicle. The grass marks indicated a rapid approach, and his movements aligned with the Greensboro, South Carolina, Florida route. But the investigation lacked a confession, an eyewitness who saw the perpetrator's face, or any biological evidence linking Cole to the car or Amelia's body. Cole also left no specific document admitting his role beyond the note Palatka, Hargrove, July, which could be seen as indirect evidence but was insufficient for a legal conclusion. That left the question: was Cole the abductor or merely a transporter acting on someone else's request, hanging in the air? Another key question revolved around the role of the intermediary woman, most likely Eleanor Hargrove. Church ledgers recorded her presence during the child-receiving period. Her handwritten note matched the timeline of Amelia's transfer to Florida, and Linda's memories matched the description of the middle-aged woman standing next to the little girl in Spartanburg. However, records do not reveal whether Eleanor knew the child was kidnapped. She may have simply participated in an illegal adoption system without knowing the illegal origin of each case, something that happened with many charitable organizations of the era. Conversely, she could have been a central figure in a small ring, serving as the safe woman who traveled with children to avoid suspicion and create the appearance of legitimacy when crossing state lines. The fact that Eleanor had lived in Spartanburg before moving to Florida heightened suspicion about her deeper involvement, but she died in 1998. Taking all answers with her. Another lingering question was, why were pages missing from the 1957 file? 3 pages from the initial interview with Lester Cole were no longer in the official Greensboro PD archives. When Calloway discovered a microfilm copy containing 2 of those 3 pages, he realized the missing pages could be due to storage error, file transfers through multiple systems, or deliberate removal to reduce attention on Cole amid the political pressure of the time, when local police were often pushed to resolve cases quickly to avoid community panic. There was no evidence of intentional cover-up, but the fact that the missing pages described Cole's unusual behavior left the question unresolved. Additionally, was there an organization behind it, or was this the act of individuals? Historical analysis of illegal adoption systems in the South shows a loose network, not a professional criminal organization, but a chain of individuals, some from religious communities, some from charitable groups, some operating independently, who shared requests and information in ways that were hard to trace. Cole may have taken Amelia from Greensboro based on a verbal agreement with someone who needed a child for illegal adoption. Eleanor may have been the link between Cole and the Hargrove Church. Reverend Hargrove may have accepted the child without asking deep questions. Each person may not have been aware of the full chain, but together, their actions formed a semi-structured network in which children could be moved across states without records. Calloway tried to determine whether Cole had ever worked for a larger organization, but his employment records only showed odd jobs with no official connections. Financial records showed no payments large enough to prove he was compensated for transporting children. Yet his appearance in Jacksonville and Green Cove Springs at the exact time Amelia was delivered to Florida at least indicated participation in a systematic activity. It was also unclear why Cole participated at all. Was it for money, a personal connection in the network, or an inexplicable motive? No data provided an answer. This lack of clarity forced the official Greensboro PD file to include a cautious conclusion: most likely perpetrator is Lester Cole. But the role of other individuals in the child transport chain is not ruled out. There was also the question of the unidentified woman seen with Amelia by the gas station attendant. Though all signs pointed to Eleanor Hargrove, there was no direct photo comparison, no identification, and the church ledger did not specifically list her name for the NC July 1957 entry. Thus, the question, was the woman in Spartanburg definitely Eleanor, remained open. Calloway also asked why Amelia was chosen. The Reed family had no conflicts, no connection to Cole, no debts, no enemies. This made the hypothesis of a random abduction because she was near the road and easy to grab more likely. But randomness does not explain why the child was taken across 3 states to a church with a history of illegal adoption. The question, did someone order or request a child in 1957, remained unanswered. Finally, the biggest and most painful question, how much did Amelia remember? Linda's memories were only fragments, not enough to identify the perpetrator's face, confirm conversations between adults on the night of the handoff, or reveal the motive. Those questions could not be forced upon her, and they might never be answered. Therefore, although the Amelia Reed file was marked as solved, with regard to victim identity, the investigative conclusion had to state many core elements remain undetermined due to the 56-year time span and the death of central figures. Those questions stand as echoing voids between the 2 phases of Amelia's life: the past torn from her family and the present in which she has just found them, voids no one can ever fully fill. Upon completing the full analysis, Greensboro PD prepared a professional summary report for Case 57-AR, considering it one of the most important legal teaching cases in local investigative history. The first lesson was the importance of evidence preservation procedures, even when technology at the time of collection was inadequate for exploitation. The small necklace, thought to be worthless after 56 years, became the key to confirming the victim's identity. Had that evidence not been properly preserved in the early years, or reinventoried when the case went cold, the mystery might never have been solved. As a result, Greensboro PD updated its evidence storage protocols for missing persons cases, ensuring all items in direct contact with the victim are kept in conditions that allow forensic value to be recovered decades later. The second lesson lay in the revolutionary role of DNA testing in resolving cold cases. Missing persons cases from the 1950s, 60s had no video, no digital traces, no biological evidence stored to modern standards. Yet the advent of STR technology and the expansion of civilian genetic databases through commercial testing kits created a DNA linkage network unprecedented in human history. The Amelia Reed case became a prime example of how a commercial DNA sample combined with old evidence could break a half-century silence. Greensboro PD noted this as the first case they solved through the intersection of private genetic databases and modern forensic analysis, and they proposed a policy encouraging relatives of missing persons to submit DNA to broaden comparison scope. The third lesson was the necessity of maintaining investigative file integrity, especially in cases spanning generations of detectives. The missing pages from the 1957 Lester Cole report allowed a key suspect to escape needed scrutiny for years. Though the cause could not be determined, Greensboro PD treated it as a serious storage failure and overhauled its cold case management system to new standards, including full digitization of historical documents and parallel storage at multiple locations to prevent loss. The fourth lesson was sociological. The Amelia case revealed the widespread existence of informal adoption systems across the American South in the 1950s, 1960s. A legal gray zone that once allowed children to be moved without paperwork across states. That Amelia was swept into that system, accidentally or deliberately, showed the need to understand history more deeply so as not to confuse criminal acts with the complex social structures of the past. For Greensboro PD, the Amelia Reed case became an iconic milestone. A disappearance that once shook the local community was closed, forgotten, then resurrected by DNA technology and the persistence of the cold case unit. The file was added to internal training programs as a classic example of three factors: investigative patience, the importance of evidence, and 21st century technology's ability to solve cases. In the official conclusion, Greensboro PD marked the case status as solved because the victim's identity was confirmed, because Amelia Reed was alive and reunited with her family, because the 56-year broken journey had been reconnected. Partially, because the perpetrator's identity could not be confirmed 100%, because the intermediary woman died before questioning, and because many links in the 1957 illegal child transport chain remain beyond history's reach. The final line of the report read, "The Amelia Reed case proves that time can blur every trace, but cannot erase truth when science, persistence, and living witnesses converge." This file is closed, but its lessons will continue to shape future investigations. The story of Amelia Reed, found after 56 years under the new identity of Linda Mayfield, is not only a closed criminal file, but a reflection of issues that still persist in modern American life. The vulnerability of children, gaps in community protection systems, and the increasingly vital role of DNA technology. From Amelia's case, readers can draw practical lessons not from abstract philosophy, but from the details of the incident itself. First, the story reminds us that the smallest piece of evidence can save a life. The wooden necklace, the only item remaining from the day Amelia disappeared, seemed meaningless, yet became the DNA bridge that identified the victim after half a century. In today's world, this reminds us to carefully preserve medical records, personal documents, and biological information, because in the age of data, tiny details determine protection. Second, the Amelia case shows that personal freedom must be paired with community vigilance. Amelia was abducted in just 90 seconds, a length of time any American parent today could let their guard down. The story re-asks the question, Are we properly assessing risks to children? Are we placing too much trust in the safety of a familiar neighborhood? In reality, many child abductions in the U.S. happen right in front of the house, just like Amelia. Third, modern DNA technology is a new social benefit. Thanks to 23andMe and Forensic STR, a 61-year-old woman without a birth certificate found her family. This reminds every individual of the value of responsible DNA testing, not just to explore ancestry, but to support missing persons cases and reunite broken families. Finally, Amelia's story teaches us that truth does not disappear, it only waits to be found. That encourages every contemporary American to persistently seek their origins, remain open to the past, and understand that healing sometimes comes from facing the truth, even if the truth arrives later than a lifetime. Thank you for following the 56-year journey to find the truth about Amelia. Every subscription helps us continue telling stories that were thought to be lost forever. See you in the next video, where even the smallest clue can unlock an entire truth.